The night was soft over the island of Delos. Waves moved quietly against the shore, carrying the faint silver of the moon across their gentle crests. Stars gathered in still clusters, patient and watchful, as if they knew something sacred was about to happen. On the lonely island, hidden among olive trees and pale rocks, a woman rested in the shadows of the branches. She was Leto, daughter of the Titans, weary and heavy with child. Her dark hair clung to her face with the dampness of her long wandering. Her hands pressed against the earth, searching for comfort in the cool ground. The air was sweet with the smell of flowering thyme, and a breeze passed through the leaves like a lullaby. Yet beneath the calm, there had been struggle. Leto had wandered across many lands, turned away again and again. No land had welcomed her, for Hera, the queen of Olympus, had forbidden any place under the sun to shelter her. Still, the island of Delos, floating light upon the sea, had offered her refuge. Leto closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the whispers of the sea. She spoke softly to herself, though no one was near. Here my children will be safe. Here they will take their first breath. Her voice trembled, but the island seemed to steady her. A hush spread through the grove, and the air grew warm, as though the very earth wished to cradle her in its arms. Soon the time came. The stars dimmed as dawn stirred faintly beyond the horizon. Leto leaned forward, her body filled with both pain and wonder. Sweat gathered on her brow, and she pressed her lips together, holding back cries. Around her, the nymphs of Delos appeared, gentle as shadows. They knelt close, bringing cool water from the streams, pressing her hands with their own, speaking quiet words that drifted like leaves in the wind. From her struggle, a child was born, small, radiant, and calm. She was Artemis, firstborn of the twins, her dark eyes opening to the soft shimmer of morning light. Unlike most newborns, she seemed strangely alert, her gaze steady as if she already knew the world around her. Leto held the child close, her arms trembling from exhaustion. "My little one," she whispered, her breath slow and soft, "you will walk in freedom. You will run where no chains can bind you." Artemis made no cry. She blinked at the sky, as if watching the stars fade into the day. The nymphs, astonished, bent their heads and whispered to one another. The infant's stillness was not weakness. It was strength, a quiet presence that filled the grove with... But the birth was not yet complete. Leto's body tensed again, for a second child stirred within her. Yet the labor was long, and the pain grew heavy. Her lips trembled, her breath shallow. The nymphs looked to Artemis, uncertain, as though the newborn might already understand. And in a way, she did. For in myth, Artemis came into the world not as a helpless child, but with divine awareness. She reached her tiny hands toward her mother, her gaze unblinking, and in that strange, eternal moment, she seemed to lend her mother courage. The nymphs believed they saw the glow of moonlight settle on the infant's face, steady and unwavering. With Artemis at her side, Leto gathered her strength. Hours passed, the sun rising higher, until at last, another child came forth, bright, golden, and filled with light. He was Apollo, twin brother of Artemis, his cries piercing the still air like a new song carried into the world. The grove was silent for a long while, broken only by the sound of the sea and the cries of the newborn boy. Artemis, however, remained still, watching her brother with a gaze that was already protective. Leto leaned back against a tree, her face pale but filled with peace. She held both children close, one quiet, silver-eyed and steady, the other golden, radiant and loud. She touched their foreheads gently with her lips. "Artemis, Apollo, you are the light of my wandering." The nymphs of Delos spread word across the island. Birds stirred in the branches, singing their first songs of the morning. The sea shimmered brighter, as though honoring the birth. In Delos, the floating island, felt its roots sink deeper into the waves, forever steady now that it had become the birthplace of gods. Artemis rested silently in her mother's arms. Though she was only hours old, she seemed to listen to the winds, to the rustling leaves, to the distant cry of a deer in the hills. A strange calm settled around her, and Leto could sense it too. This child was not only her daughter. She was something wilder, something freer, touched by both moonlight and earth. As the day passed, Leto lay with her children beneath the shade of the olive trees. Apollo slept against her chest, warm and heavy, but Artemis remained watchful. The nymphs placed flowers beside her, yet she seemed more interested in the sky above and the trembling leaves around her. That evening, when the stars returned, Leto whispered to her daughter again, "You came first. You looked upon the world before your brother. You steadied me when I was weak. And I think you will always walk a step apart, quiet, but never alone." The infant stirred, her small hand brushing against her mother's cheek. The stars above flickered softly, as if answering the unspoken promise. The island of Delos lay in silence again, but not in emptiness. A new presence had been born there, one that would walk forests, mountains, and moonlit paths. Artemis, goddess of the hunt, protector of wild things, child of silver light, had taken her first breath. And though she was only a newborn, the world already seemed to lean closer, curious about the steps she would one day take. The island of Delos grew quiet after the birth, as if holding its breath to cradle the children in silence. Days turned into nights and nights into days, and beneath the olive branches, Leto nursed her twins. Apollo's voice often filled the grove with strong cries, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Artemis, however, remained calm, her eyes wandering upward to the moon and the stars, as if they were already her companions. The nymphs of Delos often whispered of her difference. They saw how the little girl reached out not for toys or flowers, but for the light of the sky. They saw how her gaze followed the deer that grazed at the edge of the forest, her small fingers twitching with fascination at their grace. One evening, as the waves rolled gently against the shore, Leto spoke softly to her daughter. "My Artemis," she said, brushing the child's dark hair from her brow. "You were born with silence in your heart. But silence can be strong. Silence can watch, listen, and understand." The child's eyes, deep as midnight pools, lifted to meet her mother's. Though she was still young, she seemed to understand, and she pressed her tiny hand against her mother's cheek. When the time came for the twins to leave Delos, the gods of Olympus gathered. The island had been their cradle, but their lives would not remain there. Carried across the sea, Artemis and Apollo were brought to their father, mighty Zeus, ruler of Olympus. The halls of the gods gleamed with gold and silver, yet Artemis did not blink at their brightness. She clung to her mother's hand, her steps light, her eyes moving past the columns and thrones to the distant trees beyond. Apollo, radiant and golden, ran ahead, already eager to stand in the light of their father. Zeus sat upon his high throne, lightning coiled at his side. His deep eyes softened as he looked upon his children. He stretched out his great hand, resting it upon their heads. "You are mine, and yet more than mine," he said in a voice like steady thunder. "Tell me, my daughter, my son, what do you desire?" Apollo spoke first, his voice clear though still young. "Father, grant me the gift of song and light. Let me guide men with music and truth, and let my arrows fly swift and straight." Zeus nodded, his smile bright as dawn. He turned then to Artemis, who stood quiet, her gaze fixed on her father without fear. The hall waited, the air still. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Father, grant me freedom. Let me run where I choose, through mountains and forests. Give me bow and arrow, so I may walk with wild creatures. Let me guard the young, and let no man force me into chains of love if I do not wish it. I will be a maiden forever, free beneath the moon." A murmur rose among the gods, for never had a child spoken with such clarity. Leto lowered her eyes, unsure how Zeus would answer. But Zeus's deep laughter rolled like distant thunder. He leaned forward, resting his hand upon Artemis's shoulder. "My daughter," he said, "your wish is bold, yet your spirit is steady. So let it be. You shall walk free, untouched, unbound. You shall guard the wilds, and your arrows shall strike true. You shall be the protector of children and maidens, and the moon shall be your companion." At his words, silver light shimmered through the hall, soft and pale, like moonbeams spilling across marble. Artemis lifted her head, and though still a child, her eyes gleamed with purpose. From that day, she roamed the hills and forests of Olympus. The nymphs followed her, laughing as they learned her ways. She asked for no golden robes or jeweled crowns, only a short tunic for ease of running, and boots fit for climbing over rock and root. She braided her dark hair back so the wind might cool her face as she moved. When Apollo lifted his lyre to sing, Artemis raised her bow to the trees. His music filled the air like sunlight. Her arrows flew like moonlight across the night. They were twins, yet different as day and night, each shining in their own way. Often, she wandered alone into the woods. The air would grow quiet around her, as though the trees themselves leaned in to listen. She traced the patterns of leaves with her fingers, felt the cool bark beneath her palms, and pressed her ear against the earth to hear the secret heartbeat of the land. She walked barefoot through streams, the water curling gently around her ankles. Wherever she stepped, animals gathered, curious but unafraid. One twilight, as she stood on the slope of a hill, she whispered to herself, "Let me belong here, in the wild places. Let me never forget their voice." And the breeze seemed to answer, carrying the scent of pine and fresh rain. Her bow became her companion, light and strong. She practiced daily, drawing the string with quiet focus, releasing each arrow with care. She did not shoot to harm, but to know her strength, to feel the air shift as the arrow flew. When she missed, she bent to the ground, touching the soil where the arrow landed, whispering to it as if to say, "Teach me again." As the moon rose above the forests of Olympus, she often walked in silence, her pale face glowing faintly in its light. The stars followed her, steady and patient, and the world seemed to fall into rhythm with her steps. In those quiet nights, Artemis began to dream of greater paths. She saw herself not only among the woods of Olympus, but across distant mountains, through shadowed valleys, by rivers wide and slow. She imagined guiding the steps of hunters, protecting those who wandered lost in the dark, watching over mothers as they brought forth new life. Her heart, though calm, was never still. One evening, as Apollo played his lyre by the fire, he looked across the flames at his sister. "You walk in silence, Artemis. Tell me, do you not wish to be praised, as poets will praise me in song?" Artemis looked into the firelight, her face steady. "Your music is for men. My song is for the forest, for the deer that drink at the stream, for the owl that calls from the branches. If they know me, it is enough." Apollo smiled, but he did not understand. Still, he knew her heart was true. And so, under the moonlit sky, the childhood of Artemis unfolded. She grew not in palaces, but in wild groves. She learned not from tutors, but from the whisper of leaves and the flight of birds. Each day shaped her more, until the goddess within her no longer seemed a child at all, but something timeless, steady, and free. The forests awaited her, the rivers called her name, and the mountains lifted their arms to the sky, ready to welcome her steps. And Artemis, with quiet eyes and steady heart, was ready to answer. The morning air was cool on Mount Olympus. Dew glistened on the grass, small pearls of water trembling beneath the first touch of sunlight. A hush lingered in the groves, as if the day itself was still stretching awake. Artemis stood at the edge of the forest, bow in hand, watching the mist curl around the roots of the trees. Her breath was steady, her eyes calm, yet inside her heart there stirred a quiet longing. She had grown quickly, her spirit already tall, her steps light and sure. The forests of Olympus knew her well, yet she wished for more tools, companions, and the strength to walk farther than ever before. She longed not for power over others, but for closeness with the world she loved. One evening, she went to her father. Zeus sat on his high throne, the clouds swirling in pale gold around him. His voice was heavy as rolling thunder, yet when he saw Artemis approach, it softened. "What brings you to me, daughter of the silver light?" he asked, resting his hand upon his knee. Artemis bowed her head, her hair falling like night around her shoulders. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Father, you granted me freedom. You gave me the wild forest to walk as my own. But the path is long, and no one walks forever alone. If I am to guard the mountains, the rivers, the valleys, then I will need companions, faithful and strong. And I ask, too, for the gifts of the hunt, a bow that will not fail me, arrows swift and true, and hounds that can run beside me." Zeus's eyes glimmered with pride, for he saw her courage and her steadiness. He lifted his great hand and called for the Cyclopes, the one-eyed smiths of fire and stone who forged wonders in their smoky caves. Their hammers rang like deep bells as they stepped forth, sparks still clinging to their hands. "Make her a bow," Zeus commanded. "Light as breath, strong as fate. Shape her arrows so they fly silent and straight, finding always the path she desires." The Cyclopes bent their heads, their single eyes glowing. They worked with bronze and silver, bending light itself into the curve of the bow. When it was done, they placed it in Artemis's hands. It was smooth and shining, its weight perfect, as though it had always belonged to her. She strung it with ease, the string humming like the faint note of a lyre. Next came her hounds. From the mountains of Arcadia they were brought, tall and lean, their coats shining like polished stone. Their eyes were bright and eager, their breath quick with the joy of running. They circled Artemis, pressing their noses to her hands, their tails brushing against her legs. She bent low to them, smiling softly. "You will run with me," she whispered. "You will be my shadows in the forest, my companions on the path. Never chained, never broken. Free as I am free." The hounds whined with gentle joy, already bound to her heart. But Artemis's gifts were not yet complete. She turned again to her father, her gaze steady. "Give me maidens, father, companions who will walk beside me. Let them be free as I am, bound not to men, but to the forest. Let us share in the hunt together." Zeus considered. "If I grant this, they must choose freely. Will you accept them as they are, not as you shape them?" "I will," Artemis replied, "for freedom is not mine alone to keep." So Zeus called forth the daughters of the river gods and of the great seas, young maidens with laughter bright as water flowing over stone. They came willingly, drawn by Artemis's quiet strength. She welcomed them one by one, not as servants but as sisters. Together they braided their hair, ran through the groves, and bathed in the cool streams. Their voices lifted in song, but always soft, never breaking the stillness of the woods. From that day, Artemis was no longer alone. Wherever she walked, her hounds padded close, their ears sharp to every rustle. Her maidens followed, their steps light, their laughter like wind through pine needles. The forest seemed fuller, the air alive with companionship. One twilight, as the moon rose pale above the mountains, Artemis tested her bow. She stood among her maidens, the hounds restless at her feet. She drew the string back slowly, her breath flowing with emotion. The arrow flew, silent as a falling leaf, and struck true upon a distant mark. The maidens clapped softly, their voices rising in gentle praise. But Artemis only lowered her bow, her eyes on the moon above. "This is not for pride," she whispered. "It is for the silence of the forest. It is for the path that waits." Her maidens looked at her with quiet wonder, for they saw in her not only a huntress but something deeper, a guardian, a guide, a sister who belonged as much to the wild as to herself. And so the gifts of Artemis were gathered, bow and arrows of silver strength, hounds swift as wind, maidens loyal and free. She carried them not as treasures, but as companions of her spirit. Together, they stepped into the world, their path lit by the soft glow of the moon. The forests welcomed them, the mountains echoed their footsteps, and the rivers whispered their names. The night air was alive with the breath of freedom, and Artemis walked it at heart, her bow steady in her hand, her eyes lifted to the stars. And beyond the hills, beyond the valleys, the wider world waited, wild places still untouched, calling softly for the goddess who would walk them. The forest stretched wide before Artemis, a sea of green shadows and sunlit patches. Pines rose tall and fragrant, their needles whispering when the wind passed. Oaks spread their branches like open arms, and beneath them, moss softened the earth. The air was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves, the call of distant birds, and the faint rush of a hidden stream. Artemis walked at the front, her silver bow resting across her shoulder. Around her padded the hounds, their noses pressed to the ground, their ears twitching with every sound. Behind them, the maidens followed, their steps light, their tunics brushing against ferns and grass. It was early morning. Mist clung to the valleys, curling through the trees like a veil. Dew sparkled on every leaf, tiny jewels that caught the first shafts of sunlight. Artemis paused at the crest of a hill, lifting her face to the breeze. She closed her eyes, letting the scents wash over her, pine, damp soil, and the faint musk of deer hidden deeper in the woods. "This is where we begin," she whispered. Her voice was soft, but her companions heard. The maidens gathered close, their hands brushing against one another in quiet excitement. The hounds whined low, restless to run. Artemis raised her bow, not to shoot, but to feel its weight against the morning air. She smiled faintly. "We walk not for killing, but for knowing. To learn the forest, we must walk as part of it." The maidens nodded, their eyes wide with trust. They began to move again, their steps slow and careful. The forest was alive around them, yet it did not shrink away from their presence. Birds still sang. A squirrel darted along a branch overhead, pausing to look at them curiously. A doe lifted her head from the stream, water dripping from her mouth, and for a moment her dark eyes met Artemis's. The goddess lowered her bow, offering only silence and stillness. The doe lingered, then turned lightly back into the trees. One of the maidens, her voice hushed, leaned close. "She was not afraid of you." Artemis smiled. "The wild knows its own. If we walk gently, the forest does not flee." As the day stretched on, they moved deeper into the woods. The hounds ran ahead, weaving through the undergrowth, but always returned, circling around Artemis like shadows. Their tongues hung loose, their eyes bright with joy. The maidens, too, grew braver, their laughter rising softly when they spotted a rabbit darting between the roots or a hawk circling far above. When noon came, they rested by a stream. The water was clear and cold, flowing over smooth stones. Artemis knelt and cupped it in her hands, drinking slowly, then splashing her face. The maidens followed, their laughter rippling like the water itself. The hounds plunged their muzzles into the stream, shaking droplets into the air. As they rested, Artemis watched the light on the water. Her thoughts were quiet, but steady. "The hunt is not only the arrow and the chase," she murmured. "It is watching, waiting, listening. It is knowing when to move and when to be still." Her companions fell silent, hearing the truth in her voice. The forest, too, seemed to hush, the wind calming for a moment as though agreeing. When the shadows lengthened and the air cooled, Artemis rose again. The hounds grew alert, ears pricking. A faint rustle carried through the trees, soft and measured. She lifted her bow, string taut, though her eyes were calm. Through the mist came a stag, tall and strong, its antlers wide as branches. It stepped carefully, each hoof touching the ground with grace. The maidens held their breath, their hands pressing against their lips. The hounds quivered but did not bark, waiting for Artemis. She watched the stag, her arrow ready. Time seemed to slow. The creature lifted its head, the fading light painting its coat gold. Its eyes, deep and steady, met hers. Artemis exhaled, lowering her bow. The arrow did not fly. Instead, she placed her hand upon the string, loosening it gently. The stag stood still for a heartbeat, then bowed its head, antlers dipping toward the earth. With one final glance, it turned and vanished into the forest shadows, silent as mist. A sigh rose from the maidens, a mix of awe and relief. One whispered, "Why did you not take him?" Artemis looked into the fading light, her face calm. "Because he was not meant for death. Not every hunt ends in the strike. Sometimes the gift is only in seeing, in knowing, in letting the wild walk free." The maidens lowered their heads, understanding in their own quiet way. As night fell, the forest wrapped itself in silver. The moon rose, soft and glowing, spilling its light across the leaves. Artemis and her companions walked homeward, their steps slow, their hearts full. The hounds trotted at their side, their shadows stretching long in the moonlight. That night, as Artemis lay beneath the stars, her bow beside her, she whispered into the dark, "The world is wide, and there is much to learn. Let me walk it with patience. Let me guard it with care." The wind stirred through the branches, carrying her words away like seeds in the air. The stars shimmered in answer, steady and kind. The first hunts had begun, not of blood and trophies, but of closeness, of listening, of becoming one with the quiet voice of the wild. And beyond the mountains, beyond the valleys, the next paths waited, calling softly for her steps. The night was quiet over the mountains, the air cool and clear. A pale glow stretched across the slopes, softening every edge, turning stone and pine into silver shapes. Above, the moon rose full and steady, bathing the world in calm light. Artemis walked among the shadows, her steps soundless. Her hounds moved at her side, their eyes catching the glow, their bodies lean and silent as they padded across moss and rock. Behind them, her maidens followed, their white tunics brushing against ferns, their hair shining faintly in the silver light. The forest, alive by day, seemed changed beneath the moon. Owls stirred from their hollows, wings rustling softly as they glided through the air. Crickets sang low and steady, a rhythm that filled the spaces between silence. The stream that trickled by day now glimmered like liquid glass, carrying the reflection of stars along its winding path. Artemis lifted her gaze to the sky. The moon seemed close, almost within reach. Its light touched her face, soft against her skin, as if it knew her, as if it had been waiting for her all along. She slowed her steps, letting her companions drift behind her. Alone at the edge of a clearing, she whispered, "Are you my guide?" The hounds lifted their heads, ears twitching, but the only answer was the still glow of the moon. Yet Artemis felt it inside her chest, a quiet pull, a steadying hand. She knelt and placed her palm against the earth. The soil was cool, damp with the breath of night. She closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, the pine, the moss, the faint sweetness of flowers that only opened after sunset. The moonlight spread across her, and for a moment she felt herself both small and vast, a child beneath the sky and a goddess within it. One of her maidens stepped closer, her voice soft. "Lady, you look as if you were speaking with someone unseen." Artemis opened her eyes, her expression calm. "Perhaps I am." The maiden tilted her head. "Do you hear words?" "No," Artemis answered, rising slowly. Her bow glimmered in the silver light as she lifted it. "Not words, only knowing. The moon does not speak, but it stays. It keeps its watch steady, gentle, never burning, never leaving. I think it walks beside me." The maiden's eyes widened with wonder. She looked at the moon then, and though she saw only light, she felt something of her goddess's truth. As the nights passed, Artemis found herself drawn more and more to the silver hours. By day she roamed the forests, but by night she felt the world open in a deeper way. She would walk for hours, bow in hand, following the pale path of moonlight that streamed across ridges and valleys. Sometimes she paused to watch the deer move quietly between the trees, their coats glowing faintly beneath the silver light. Sometimes she lingered at the streams, dipping her hands into the cool, shining water. The night was hers, not for conquest, but for companionship. One evening, as the moon hung low and wide, Artemis called her maidens to her. They gathered in a meadow, the grass damp beneath their feet, the air filled with the scent of night-blooming flowers. "Look around you," Artemis said, her voice gentle, yet carrying through the hush. "The night is not darkness alone. It holds its own light, softer than the sun, kinder in its glow. It is a place of rest, a place of wonder. And I will walk it always." The maidens lowered their heads, their hearts stirred by her words. They, too, felt the calm that spread across the meadow. The hounds lay down upon the grass, their bodies relaxed, their eyes half closed. That night, Artemis lifted her bow high, pointing it toward the moon. The silver curve of the weapon caught the moonlight, shining as if it were made from the very glow above. For a moment, it seemed a bow and the moon were reflections of each other, bound in quiet kinship. As she lowered it, Artemis whispered, "If I must guide, let me guide by your light. If I must protect, let me protect with your calm." From then on, she was not only goddess of the hunt. She was bound to the moon, its companion and its keeper. When men looked into the night sky and saw its glow, they would one day think of her, running free among the shadows, silver bow in hand, guarding the forests and the quiet lives within them. The path of Artemis had widened. No longer tied only to the forest floor, she now walked beneath the sky itself. The moon was her lantern, her shield, her companion across endless nights. And as she stepped once more into the forest, the trees welcomed her with silver branches, the streams with glowing ripples, the hills with soft shadows. The world seemed to whisper, carrying her presence forward. The moonlit path was hers now, and it stretched farther than she could yet see. The island of Delos still carried the memory of her birth. The light of Apollo's lyre often drifted across the sea, but Artemis chose a quieter path. She wandered the forests, the mountain ridges, and the streams, seeking her own place apart from the halls of Olympus. When she was still a young maiden, she stood before her father Zeus. His throne glowed with thunderlight, and the halls of heaven echoed with the voices of gods and spirits. Yet Artemis came without fear. Her silver gaze was steady as she approached. "Father," she said, her voice calm as a still lake, "grant me gifts that will keep me free. Let me remain a maiden forever, untouched by marriage. Let me roam the forests and mountains, guarding the young and the wild. Give me bows and arrows, swift as light, so I may protect myself and those who follow me. Grant me a band of nymphs, free like myself, to share the hunt. And give me the task of bringing light, so that I may guide those who travel in darkness." Zeus listened in silence, his hand resting upon the scepter of storms. He had given great kingdoms to others, Poseidon the sea, Hades the underworld, Apollo the music of light. Yet this daughter's request was different. She asked not for power over men or thrones of stone. She asked for freedom. A rare softness touched Zeus's gaze. "You shall have what you seek," he answered. "Remain forever as you are, untouched by binding chains. Take the bow and the arrows, for Hephaestus will forge them, and the Cyclopes will give their fire to the making. Take the nymphs as companions of the wild. Take the hounds swift as the wind, and take dominion over the hills, the forests, and the moonlight itself." Artemis bowed her head, not in submission, but in gratitude. Around her the gods watched in silence, for they saw her not as a child, but as a goddess in her own right. Hera's gaze was cool, but even she gave no word against the vows. Apollo, her twin, touched her hand gently, and in his eyes shone quiet pride. Soon after, the Cyclopes labored in their forge, hammering metal that sang like stars. From their work came the bow, strong yet graceful, and arrows tipped with shining silver. Artemis held them, and they seemed to glow with moonlight even in the brightness of day. The nymphs gathered around her, bright-eyed maidens of springs, forests, and meadows. They laughed with freedom, their hair crowned with flowers, their feet quick across grass and stone. Each had chosen to remain unbound, to follow Artemis wherever she led. They became her companions, her sisters of the hunt, bound not by chains but by choice. The hounds were brought forth next, lean and swift, their coats shining like polished bronze, their eyes burning with sharpness. They leapt at her side, eager for the chase, their howls echoing like music through the wild. Artemis bent to them and touched their heads, and they stilled beneath her hand. From that day forward, Artemis's vows were sealed. She would wander free, forever a maiden, forever guardian of the wild. She would bring life, and she would bring death, gentle to the young and merciless to the reckless. She would shine in moonlight, while Apollo blazed in the sun. Her name spread across mountains and islands. Shepherds spoke of seeing her white robes flash between trees. Fishermen told of her light shining upon the sea when the moon rose. Maidens prayed to her for protection in childbirth, and hunters whispered her name before releasing their arrows. But though her power grew, Artemis carried it lightly. She walked not as a queen upon a throne, but as a huntress upon soft earth. She drank from springs, rested beneath oaks, and sang with her nymphs beside hidden fires. The forest itself seemed to breathe with her presence, and wherever she stepped, silence and stillness followed. At night, when the moon rose high, she would lift her bow, and the silver light seemed to bend to her will. She became not only the goddess of the hunt, but the goddess of the moon itself, carrying its glow across the sky. Her path was endless, her vows unbroken. And so the hunt began, not for prey alone, but for freedom itself. For Artemis, the chase was life, and the forest was her endless home. The vows had been spoken, and the gifts had been given. Yet Artemis did not wish to walk her path alone. She had asked her father for companions, and so the forest soon became alive with their footsteps. The first to come were the Oceanids, daughters of the sea. From deep rivers and flowing springs, they rose like dawn mist, their laughter soft as rippling water. They carried garlands of reeds and flowers, and their voices wove with the sound of running streams. Artemis welcomed them, And they bowed not in servitude but in kinship, for they too loved freedom and the open air. From the hills came the Oreads, nymphs of rocky slopes and high mountains. Their hair smelled of pine, and their eyes shone with the brightness of starlight over peaks. They walked with steady steps, their limbs strong, their spirits unafraid of storms or sharp winds. They joined Artemis gladly, for the heights belonged to them, as the bough belonged to her. The Dryads followed, spirits of trees and groves. Their bodies were graceful as young saplings, their arms supple like branches swaying in the breeze. They whispered the songs of leaves, and when Artemis entered the forest, they appeared as if called by her breath. They loved her light, for it touched their roots gently, neither scorching nor withering, but nurturing with silver glow. One by one, they gathered 60 Oceanids, 20 Oreads, and countless Dryads, maidens who vowed never to wed, never to be bound. Their laughter filled the woods, and the sound of their steps was like falling rain upon soft earth. Artemis watched them with quiet pride. "We walk not as servants, but as sisters," she told them. "Our lives belong to the forest, to the moonlight, to freedom. Together we will hunt, together we will protect, and together we will remain unbroken." The nymphs raised their hands in agreement, their voices echoing in harmony. It was not an oath of chains, but of choice, and their bond was stronger for it. Hephaestus, who had forged the bow, also sent them gifts of quivers and hunting knives, shaped with skill but light as feathers. The Cyclopes gave spears tipped with sharp stone, gleaming under starlight. Artemis distributed the weapons among her companions, teaching each to use them with care. The first hunt came beneath a rising moon. The hounds barked, their eyes sharp with fire. The nymphs strung their bows, their breaths calm and steady. The forest itself seemed to pause, waiting for the chase. From the shadows leapt a great stag, its antlers spreading wide as branches of oak. It ran with power, swift across the glades. The nymphs gave chase, their feet hardly touching the ground, their arrows glinting in silver light. Artemis herself moved like wind, her bow raised, her gaze unerring. But when the stag reached the clearing, Artemis lowered her bow. She saw in its eyes the strength of the wild, the freedom she herself cherished. She smiled softly and let it pass, its hooves striking sparks upon the stones. The nymphs followed her lead, lowering their weapons as well. The chase had been enough, the running together a joy greater than the kill. Laughter filled the forest then, not of triumph but of freedom. The nymphs danced beneath the moon, their shadows long across the grass. The hounds circled them, barking with delight. Artemis stood among them, silent yet content, the silver light crowning her hair. From that night on, the hunts of Artemis were not only for prey. They were for the bond of the sisters, for the joy of running through the wild, for the beauty of moonlight across rivers and stones. Sometimes they hunted beasts, sometimes they let them go, but always they honored the wild itself. Word spread quickly across valleys and mountains. Shepherds told of seeing white-robed maidens moving in silent packs, swifter than deer. Farmers spoke of hearing hounds baying in distant woods, though no mortal huntsman was near. Children gazed at the moon and whispered that the goddess and her companions were watching from above. The companions of Artemis were more than followers. They were her chosen family, bound not by blood but by vow, united in freedom, forever wandering at her side. And wherever they walked, the forest felt alive, as if singing with them. Even though Artemis wandered freely among mountains and forests, word of her deeds began to travel beyond the hills. Shepherds, hunters, and travelers spoke quietly of the maiden goddess with the silver bow, moving silently through trees, followed by hounds and loyal companions. They told of her mercy toward the wild, of the ways she spared creatures yet guided her maidens with precision. Slowly, mortals began to see her as more than a fleeting presence in the woods. They saw her as divine. At first, it was small gestures. A shepherd left a simple stone at the edge of the forest, carved with his own hands to honor the goddess who protected the flocks. A maiden placed flowers beside a stream, where Artemis had once rested, her steps having brushed the water into gentle ripples. Even a lone fisherman, waiting for the quiet pull of his net, whispered prayers to her, seeking protection from storms and guidance under the moon. Artemis noticed these signs, though she never sought them. She walked beneath the moonlight and felt the warmth of respect offered by unseen hands. She did not crave worship, but she accepted it as a reflection of the bond she carried with the natural world. It was not about praise, it was about understanding, about humans recognizing the sacred in the wild places she loved. One morning, Artemis descended into a valley where the earth rose gently into hills. The soil was soft, scattered with wildflowers and herbs, and the stream ran steady, singing over smooth stones. She paused, noticing shapes in the grass, small piles of stones, carefully stacked, each one balanced with care. Around them, faint markings had been carved: a bow, a hound, a moon. Her eyes softened. She knelt beside them, tracing the carvings with her fingertips. "They honor the hunt," she whispered, "and the freedom of the forest." The nymphs watched silently from the shadows. Their respect mirrored Artemis's own, though they understood only in part the connection humans felt toward the divine. Artemis stood, glancing at the sky. The moon hung pale and steady, and its light seemed to approve. "This is a place for them," she said softly. "Not for chains, not for sacrifice. Only for remembrance. A shelter for thought, for hope, for the protection they cannot yet understand." And so the first simple temples arose, not as grand stone palaces like those of Zeus or Athena, but as small clearings and groves, framed by standing stones, ringed with flowers, and often beside gentle streams. Mortals traveled to these places quietly, leaving offerings of food, flowers, or carved images, never loud or demanding. They whispered prayers or sang soft songs, learning to walk in harmony with the forests and the hills. Artemis often visited these places herself. She came quietly in the moonlight, her hounds resting at her feet, her maidens nearby. She did not step on the carvings or offerings, but instead knelt, touching the soft earth beside them. Sometimes she lifted her bow in blessing, letting the silver curve reflect the moon. Sometimes she whispered a quiet word to the nymphs or her hounds, feeling the presence of mortals who honored her without expectation of reward. One night, she found a young maiden kneeling at the edge of a grove, hands pressed together in prayer. Her hair was tangled, her eyes wide with hope and fear. Artemis stepped lightly to the girl, her movements silent, almost like the shifting of leaves. "Why do you kneel here alone?" Artemis asked, her voice gentle. The girl lifted her face. "I have wandered far," she said. "I seek protection for my brother, who travels through the mountains. I do not know if you hear me, goddess, but I hoped." Artemis bent low, her gaze steady. "I hear," she said simply. "The forests see all who walk within them, and the moonlight follows. You do not need to cry alone. Walk in patience, and you will find your brother." The girl looked at her in awe, then bowed deeply. Artemis rose, her maidens stepping forward to guide the girl to the path that would lead home. The hounds padded softly, and the forest seemed to sigh in contentment. These temples grew over time. Mortals brought their families, and each stone, each flower, each offering became a part of the quiet story of Artemis's influence on the world. Yet she never stayed in one place long. The forests called her to new streams, new hills, new mountains. The temples were reminders, not homes. They were small spaces where mortals could honor her, and through them, Artemis understood the hearts of humans better, their fear, their hope, their quiet longing to walk alongside the divine. Even among the temples, her nymphs continued their hunts. The Oreads scaled cliffs, the Dryads moved silently among trees, and the Oceanids laughed by running streams. Artemis herself walked among them all, teaching them patience, focus, and care. She showed them how to track without harming, how to follow a trail without scaring the creatures, and how to listen to the voice of the forest. As the moon rose high in the night sky, Artemis paused beside a small stone altar at the edge of a grove. Her hand brushed over the carvings left by mortals: a bow, a deer, a crescent moon. She lifted her eyes, catching the pale reflection of silver on water nearby. The nymphs gathered quietly behind her, waiting for her guidance. "This is a path of honor," Artemis said softly. "The mortals give without asking for harm. We guard, we walk, we protect. Our bows, our steps, and our hearts must be true. Only then will the forests, the streams, and the hills remain free." The hound shifted at her feet, ears twitching at a distant sound. A deer stepped lightly from the shadows, pausing to look at her. Artemis lifted her bow, not in anger, but in greeting. The deer bowed its head and then moved on, silent as the night. In this way, Artemis taught the nymphs, the animals, and even the mortals the hunt was not only for prey, but for harmony. The temples, small and quiet, became places of learning as well as devotion. Children who wandered too close to the forest were guided to leave gifts and prayers, learning respect for the woods. Hunters and shepherds gave thanks before taking their first steps into the wild. And through all this, Artemis moved unseen, ever the guardian of freedom, the protector of life, the mistress of the moonlight. By the end of each night, the moonlight had traveled across hills, streams, and valleys. Artemis's steps had touched the soil, her hounds had rested beside the streams, and her maidens had sung softly in gratitude. The temples, though small, now held the essence of the goddess who walked freely, teaching both mortals and immortals the balance of life, freedom, and protection. And as the stars faded before the morning sun, Artemis turned once more to the forest, knowing her path was never ending, her watch never complete, yet always fulfilling. The first temples were only the beginning, a quiet testament to the goddess who walked among trees, streams, and moonlight, free in every step. The forests of Olympus were wide, yet Artemis felt a pull toward lands beyond the familiar hills and streams. She had learned the ways of her companions, the rhythm of her hounds, and the patience of the hunt within familiar groves, but the wild had no borders, and the goddess longed to test herself in new realms. One morning, when the sunlight filtered through the pines in long golden columns, Artemis gathered her maidens. The Oreads flexed their limbs, ready to scale cliffs and boulders. The Dryads brushed their fingertips over tree bark, feeling the rhythm of sap and root. The Oceanids listened to distant rivers, hearing patterns that would guide them across mountains. Even the hounds trembled with quiet excitement, tails flicking in anticipation. Today, Artemis said, her voice calm yet resolute, we leave the familiar hills. Beyond Olympus lies the untamed forest, valleys where no human has walked, rivers that twist and turn like serpents, and mountains that pierce the clouds. There we will hunt, and we will learn. The maidens nodded, understanding her intent. Their feet had carried them through streams, hills, and groves, but they had never ventured so far from the light of Olympus. They moved as one, quiet yet coordinated. Artemis led, her bow resting across her shoulder, her eyes scanning the terrain. The hounds ran ahead in pairs, noses low, searching for signs of movement in the underbrush. The Oreads climbed ahead to survey the land, their sharp eyes catching trails and tracks invisible to others. The Oceanids followed the rivers, mapping their twists and bends, while the Dryads guided them through groves where roots could trip even the most careful traveler. The first prey of the journey appeared at dusk, a herd of wild goats grazing near the rocky slopes of a distant hill. Artemis crouched low behind a boulder, watching their movements. The herd was alert, the younglings close to their mothers, tails flicking nervously. She gestured to her companions with subtle movements. The nymphs fanned out, keeping their steps soft and careful. The hounds crept forward, muscles coiled, breath slow and measured. Every movement was deliberate, each step a lesson in patience and awareness. The arrow in her hand gleamed faintly in the fading light. Artemis's eyes followed the largest goat, a male with curved horns and steady hoofs. But before releasing the arrow, she paused. The goat lifted its head, eyes meeting hers. In that gaze, she saw life, resilience, and the pulse of the wild. She lowered the bow. Not today, she whispered. Her voice barely carried beyond her lips, yet the nymphs understood instantly. The hunt was not always meant to end in capture or death. Sometimes the lesson was in observation, in timing, in respect. The hounds barked softly in excitement at the movement of the herd, but Artemis raised a hand, calming them. The goats leapt over rocky ridges and vanished into the shadows, free as the wind. The nymphs exhaled, their laughter low and joyous, a sound that blended with the whisper of pines and the flow of the stream nearby. Artemis smiled, her mind calm, and she turned to face the horizon. Mountains stretched endlessly, forests thickened, and rivers carved silver paths across the valleys. This was the world beyond Olympus, a world of untamed beauty and lessons still to be learned. As night fell, They made camp beside a gentle stream. The water shimmered under moonlight, and the hounds drank deeply before settling into soft piles. The nymphs prepared a small fire, its warmth touching their faces without smoke to stain the air. Artemis knelt beside the stream, cupping her hands to drink and letting the coolness flow over her fingers. The nymphs gathered around her, speaking in whispers of what they had seen during the hunt. One dryad pointed to hoof prints along the bank. "They were strong and fast," she said. "I have never seen such precision in their steps." "They are the forest's children," Artemis replied, her gaze on the rippling water. "Every creature has its place. We must understand it, not dominate it." The night deepened. Stars dotted the sky like scattered jewels, and the moon hung low and full, casting silver upon the water. Artemis rose, drawing her bow once more. She let the string hum, feeling its perfect tension, imagining arrows flying across shadowed valleys and rocky ridges. The hound stirred at her side, ready, alert, yet still waiting for her command. In the quiet, she spoke to her companions, sharing lessons of the hunt in the forest. "Observe everything," she said. "The sound of leaves, the scent of the wind, the movement of streams. Everything teaches us. The world does not hurry, and neither should we. Learn to follow the trail without disturbing it. Learn to move with the creatures, not against them." The Oceanids traced the flow of the stream with their fingers, noting every twist and eddy. The Oreads studied the rocky slopes, counting steps between boulders, predicting paths of animals in their climb. The Dryads pressed against the tree trunks, listening to the heartbeats of sap and root. Artemis watched them, proud yet serene, her mind already mapping the next day's journey. As dawn approached, a distant roar carried across the valley. Artemis paused, listening carefully. A bear, she realized, was moving near the northern slopes. The nymphs tightened their formation, learning instinctively from her posture. The hounds lifted their heads, nostrils flaring, muscles tense. Artemis led them quietly, circling down the hillside toward the creature. The bear's steps were deliberate, but it did not notice them. Artemis crouched behind a large rock, letting her eyes follow the animal. She observed its strength, its focus, and the careful way it moved through its territory. She lifted her bow once more, but again she did not strike. This hunt, too, was a lesson, to understand, to respect, to witness. The bear eventually disappeared into the thicket, leaving only the whisper of leaves in its passing. Artemis stood, her gaze soft, her heart steady. "Patience," she said to the nymphs. "The forest will always provide. We do not take more than necessary." They continued their journey, moving through forests dense and valleys wide, discovering lands where no mortal had set foot. They encountered rivers swollen with rain, cliffs that stretched to the clouds, and meadows where deer grazed in golden sunlight. Every encounter was a lesson, every step a connection to the life around them. At night, Artemis would pause beneath the moon, her hand brushing the silver arrow in her quiver. She felt the pulse of the wild, the rhythm of life in the forests and rivers. Her companions, tired but content, rested near her, trusting her guidance as much as the hounds did. The hunts beyond Olympus became a pattern, repeated over moons and seasons. Each excursion taught new lessons: how to read signs in snow, how to follow distant tracks, how to predict animal movement without frightening them. And with every step, Artemis grew more certain of her role as guardian, protector, and teacher. When they returned to the familiar forests of Olympus, the nymphs carried knowledge and stories, and Artemis carried the quiet joy of the wild. Word of her deeds had spread farther now. Travelers spoke of white robes moving in shadowed forests, of arrows appearing and disappearing like silver streaks, and of a goddess whose presence was felt more than seen. Yet Artemis remained unchanged. She walked quietly among her companions, teaching, observing, guiding, and respecting every life she encountered. Beyond Olympus, the world waited, vast and untamed, and she would always move through it with patience, freedom, and care. And as the moon rose over the familiar groves, Artemis lifted her bow, feeling its familiar weight. Her hound stirred beside her. The nymphs gathered near. She took a steady breath and whispered, "There is always more to see, more to learn, more to protect. The forest is endless, and so must we be." The winds carried her words into the night, stirring leaves, rippling streams, and distant mountains. Beyond Olympus, the hunts continued, each step a lesson, each breath a song of life. Artemis moved through the woods near Mount Kyllene, the silver light of the moon tracing her path across moss and fallen leaves. Her hounds padded silently at her side, noses brushing the damp earth, ears twitching at the faintest rustle. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine resin and the faint sweetness of night-blooming flowers. She knelt beside a stream, dipping her hands into the flowing water. The liquid shimmered under the moon, and as it dripped from her fingers, the ripples stretched outward, touching smooth stones and tangled roots. A faint rustle of leaves drew her gaze upward. A doe stood at the edge of the clearing, her coat pale under the silver light, eyes dark and steady. Artemis straightened, bow raised but relaxed. The doe did not flee. She stepped lightly into the clearing, ears turning toward the goddess. Artemis's hounds lay down, muscles coiled yet still, eyes fixed on the creature. The nymphs watched from the shadows, silent, sensing the quiet tension in the air. The doe lifted her head, nostrils flaring, and slowly moved toward a grove of birches. Artemis followed at a measured pace, bow held loosely. She noticed the way the doe's hooves pressed into the earth, leaving delicate impressions on the soft soil. She bent down briefly to observe the tracks, teaching her nymphs without words. A fawn appeared, stepping lightly behind its mother. Artemis smiled faintly, lowering her bow. She signaled the hounds to remain still, and they obeyed instantly. The nymphs approached quietly, their feet barely touching the ground, eyes wide in reverence for the gentle creatures before them. Artemis traced a finger along the fawn's footprints. "Observe their rhythm," she said softly. "Notice how they pause, how they sense danger, how they move together." The forest teaches through movement, through patience, and through care. The fawn lifted its head and looked directly at Artemis. In the stillness, she felt its life, its awareness, its trust. The moonlight reflected in its dark eyes, and for a moment, the forest seemed suspended, holding its breath. A distant owl hooted, breaking the quiet. The doe bolted lightly toward the trees, the fawn following in measured steps. Artemis let her bow rest at her side, watching them disappear into the shadows. The nymphs exhaled, their voices a quiet chorus of wonder. Artemis led them deeper into the forest, where ancient oaks stretched wide and ferns grew thick along the mossy floor. Her hounds sniffed the air, following faint trails of deer and hare. The nymphs moved around her, learning to track without disturbing the balance of the wild. Every rustle, every whisper of the wind, every shimmer of light on a leaf became a lesson. By the time they reached a clearing near the summit of Kyllene, the moon had risen higher, spilling silver over jagged rocks and flowing grass. A herd of deer grazed at the edge of the clearing. Artemis knelt, bow in hand, eyes scanning their movements. The nymphs mirrored her posture, quiet and alert, yet patient. The largest stag raised his antlers high, nostrils flaring, sensing the presence of the goddess. Artemis did not move abruptly. She exhaled slowly, letting the air carry her scent gently away. The stag shifted slightly, then returned to grazing. Artemis signaled the nymphs with a subtle tilt of her head. They lowered their bows, letting the moment exist without disturbance. The sudden snap of a twig drew her attention. A fox darted across the clearing, its fur glinting in the moonlight. The hounds twitched but did not bark. Artemis observed, noting the fox's movements, the way it slinked through grass, ears alert, eyes sharp. The nymphs followed her gaze, learning that every creature, from stag to fox, had its own rhythm, its own path through the wild. The herd began to move slowly down the slope, and Artemis rose, following them at a careful distance. The nymphs stayed behind her, moving lightly, their presence respectful. Every step, every glance, every whisper of movement was part of the forest's language. They stopped at a stream, where the water curved around mossy stones. The deer drank, cautious but calm, and Artemis watched until they finished. She knelt to touch the water, letting it flow through her fingers, and the nymphs mirrored her, learning to connect with the earth and life within it. When the herd moved on, Artemis called the hounds and led her companions back toward the forest paths they knew. The moon hung overhead, casting silver shadows across the moss and roots. The night was still, yet alive with sound, the faint rustle of leaves, the soft trickle of water, the distant call of birds returning to roost. Artemis paused at the edge of a grove, glancing back. The tracks of the deer were visible in the soft earth, a delicate map of life, movement, and trust. She traced one hoof print with her fingers, feeling the softness of the soil, the weight of the creature that had walked there. The nymphs knelt beside her, learning the subtle language of the forest. "Remember," Artemis said softly, "the hunt is not always taking. Sometimes it is watching. Sometimes it is understanding. Every creature has a story. Every movement teaches. Every life matters." They rested there until the first light of dawn began to tinge the sky with soft pinks and golds. Artemis led her companions back through the forest, their movements quiet, careful, respectful of every plant, rock, and creature along the way. The hounds followed loyally, occasionally nudging the nymphs to keep pace. As they emerged into the open hills near Olympus, Artemis looked toward the distant peaks. The deer of Kylene had taught patience, respect, and harmony. The hunts beyond Olympus were not only tests of skill, but of understanding, of walking alongside the creatures of the wild without disruption. The nymphs, their eyes bright with wonder and understanding, whispered among themselves, recounting the steps, the tracks, the silent moments of connection. Artemis walked among them, her bow across her shoulder, her steps measured and calm, knowing that each night, each hunt, each forest would continue to teach them lessons of freedom, care, and life itself. And as the sun began to rise, painting the distant hills in gold, Artemis raised her gaze to the sky, feeling the pull of the wild lands beyond the mountains. The forests waited, rivers curved, hills called, and the path of the hunt stretched endlessly, each step a continuation of the life she had vowed to protect. The sun had just begun to rise over the mountains, painting the forest with soft gold and pale green. Artemis led her nymphs along a narrow path that wound between tall oaks and thick ferns. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming flowers, with a faint tang of pine resin lingering. Each step she took was measured, her leather boots silent on the moss-covered ground, while the hounds followed, moving gracefully around fallen branches. The grove lay hidden, tucked between ridges where the sunlight dappled the forest floor in moving patterns. Artemis stopped at the edge, letting the nymphs gather around her. The space was serene, a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees, their branches arching overhead like protective arms. Streams trickled along the edges, and soft moss carpeted the earth, cushioning every footstep. "This grove is ours," Artemis said quietly. Her voice carried neither command nor pride, only calm authority. "Here we learn, rest, and prepare. It is a place to honor life and practice the ways of a hunt without harming unnecessarily." The nymphs moved through the grove with reverence. One dryad knelt beside a stream, trailing her fingers through the cool water and smiling as ripples spread outward. Another oread tested the strength of a boulder, tracing its cracks, listening to the sounds of hidden insects and small creatures moving within. The Oceanids walked along the stream bed, listening to the water's murmur and feeling the flow of life beneath the surface. Artemis observed them, her eyes reflecting the dappled sunlight filtering through the branches. She lifted her bow, flexed her fingers along the string, and then lowered it again, letting her gaze follow a deer grazing at the edge of the grove. Her hounds padded silently behind her, noses twitching as they tracked the faint scent of the animal. "Patience," she murmured, kneeling to touch the ground. "Do not move too quickly. Every sound, every smell, every shift in the earth carries meaning. Let the forest tell its story, and you will know what to do." The nymphs mirrored her movements, crouching low, eyes scanning, ears attuned to the rustling leaves. They practiced quietly, tracking the deer through shadows and light without alerting it. Artemis's steps were light, her body low, her eyes soft but focused. She whispered instructions only when necessary, teaching her companions to see without disturbing, to anticipate without forcing. A fawn emerged from the thicket, tiny and delicate, its coat still mottled with spots. Artemis lowered her bow entirely, holding her breath as it moved closer to the stream. One of the Oceanids whispered, pointing to the fawn, and Artemis nodded, acknowledging the subtle observation. "Watch," she said softly. "Notice how it steps carefully, how it senses the world without fear. Learn its rhythm, not to hunt it today, but to understand it." The hunt is as much about learning as it is about the chase. The fawn drank from the stream, then paused, looking around with wide eyes. The nymphs watched in awe, absorbing the lesson. Artemis crouched beside a fallen log, her hand brushing moss as she taught silently through gesture. She moved closer, and the fawn lifted its head, noticing her but not afraid. Artemis remained still, breathing with the same rhythm as the forest, letting the creature's trust form naturally. Hours passed, and the grove became a sanctuary of learning. The nymphs practiced their aim with arrows tipped with soft lead, releasing them into the clearing where they struck marks carefully placed without harming any living creature. They moved with the hounds, guiding them along soft trails and teaching them to anticipate without startling wildlife. Every sound, the babble of the stream, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, became part of the lesson. At midday, Artemis gathered the nymphs in a circle beneath the tallest oak. Sunlight streamed through the leaves, warm and gentle on their skin. She spoke softly, her eyes moving from one maiden to another. "You will face many forests," she said. "Some calm, some wild, some untamed. This grove is our beginning, our place of practice and understanding. You will not always strike the arrow, but you will always see the path. You will not always catch the prey, but you will always learn from it. Remember the rhythm of life. Every creature has its place, and our role is to honor it." A young Oread stepped forward, bow in hand, and nodded. "I understand, lady," she said. "We will walk with the forest, not against it." Artemis smiled, laying her hand gently on the maiden's shoulder. "Good. Never forget that the wild is alive in ways we cannot always see. Listen, observe, and respect. Then we will all move in harmony." Afterward, the nymphs explored the grove further. One dryad discovered a small hollow in an ancient tree, where mushrooms grew in clusters and a faint glow of insects shimmered at dusk. She showed it to Artemis, who knelt to examine it, marveling at the quiet intricacy of life. Another Oceanid traced the stream's path upstream, discovering a shallow pool where frogs and fish shared the water. Artemis watched, noting every observation, nodding in approval without interrupting the nymph's discoveries. The hounds roamed the grove as well, sniffing the edges of the forest, ears pricked, but always returning to Artemis's side. She scratched behind one of their ears, feeling its fur soft and warm. The nymphs smiled, watching the bond between goddess and hounds, understanding that trust and patience were as essential as skill. As evening approached, Artemis led them to the edge of the grove, where the forest opened to a hillside overlooking the valley. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows, turning the treetops to gold and bronze. She raised her bow once more, letting the string hum lightly. The nymphs mirrored her, practicing their stances, watching the distant deer move in the fading light. A quiet wind rustled through the leaves, carrying the scent of pine and flowers. Artemis inhaled deeply, feeling the pulse of life in the grove. The nymphs did the same, closing their eyes to absorb the rhythm of the forest. Even the hounds stood still, tails low, ears attentive. Night came slowly, and the grove took on the pale glow of the rising moon. Artemis led the nymphs back through the clearing, stepping softly along familiar paths. Streams shimmered silver, moss cushioned every footstep, and shadows danced gently among the trees. The nymphs followed in quiet awe, feeling the presence of the goddess, learning her patience and care. They returned to the center of the grove, gathering once more beneath the ancient oak. Artemis looked at each of them, her gaze steady and serene. "This grove is ours," she said again, softer this time. "Not only for hunting, not only for practice, but for life itself. Here, we learn to walk gently, to observe deeply, to respect always. This is the sacred rhythm of the wild. Keep it in your hearts." The nymphs nodded, their eyes wide with understanding and quiet pride. They knew the grove would remain their sanctuary, a place where they could return whenever they wandered far, whenever they needed to remember the ways of the forest, the lessons of the hunt, and the guidance of Artemis herself. The hounds lay down, resting on the soft moss. The nymphs curled nearby, eyes closing in contentment. Artemis stood at the edge of the clearing, bowing across her shoulder, watching the moon rise above the trees. The grove was alive, breathing with the rhythm of life, and Artemis felt the pulse of the forest echo in her chest. Every leaf, every stream, Every creature within the grove had a place, and she would guard it always. The forests near the coast stretched wide and untamed, where cliffs met the sea and wind carried the scent of salt and pine. Artemis moved silently through the undergrowth, her silver bow across her shoulder, hounds padding close, ears alert. The nymphs follow behind her, careful to match her pace, their eyes scanning the shadows for signs of movement. It was in this forest that she first saw him. Orion, a hunter taller than most men, with shoulders broad and hair the color of autumn leaves, moved with a quiet confidence. His bow was long, and his arrows gleamed faintly in the sunlight that filtered through the canopy. He tracked a herd of deer, careful, patient, skillful. Artemis watched him for a moment, hidden behind a tree, noting his respect for the creatures and the forest. He was unlike most hunters she had seen. He did not chase recklessly, did not scare the young or wound unnecessarily. He observed, calculated, and acted only when the moment was right. There was skill in his movements, but also patience and something quieter, an understanding of life that mirrored her own. Artemis stepped from the shadows, and Orion turned sharply. His hand went to his bow, but he did not raise it. His eyes, green and steady, met hers, and there was no fear, only recognition. "You move with care," Artemis said, her voice calm. "Not many hunters do." Orion lowered his bow, nodding in acknowledgement. "I respect the forest," he replied. "I respect its creatures. I have heard stories of you, goddess, but seeing you, it is different." The hounds at her side growled softly, not in anger, but in curiosity. Artemis touched their heads, calming them. "You tread carefully," she said, "yet I feel no danger from you. Why do you hunt here, in these forests?" "I hunt to learn," Orion answered, his eyes flicking to a deer that had paused nearby. "Not to take, not to conquer, but to understand. To see how the wild moves, how life flows, how each step matters." Artemis studied him. She lowered her bow slightly, motioning for him to follow her deeper into the forest. The nymphs trailed silently behind, observing both goddess and mortal, sensing the rare presence of trust and respect forming between them. They walked together, past streams that gleamed like silver ribbons, across moss-covered stones, under branches heavy with leaves. Artemis occasionally pointed out tracks, subtle signs of animals hidden in shadows. Orion followed attentively, bending to study prints, the angle of broken twigs, the faint marks left by hooves and paws. "You see with more than your eyes," Artemis remarked. "Most hunters miss what is spoken in silence." Orion smiled faintly. "I have tried to listen," he said, "to the wind, the earth, the movements of creatures. There is much to learn." The hounds padded ahead, noses brushing the ground. Artemis paused, watching their careful steps. "They teach you too," she said. "The hounds, the nymphs, the forest itself. Everything is a guide if you are patient." They reached a clearing where sunlight spilled over a fallen log. A young stag stood there, its coat shining in the light, eyes wide and alert. Artemis crouched, bow ready, and Orion did the same. "Do you take it?" she asked softly. Orion shook his head. "Not today." "Then watch," Artemis whispered. "Notice how it senses the shadows, how it pauses, how it trusts the path it knows. Watch without disturbing. Learn without harm." They observed together in silence. The stag grazed cautiously, ears flicking at every sound. Artemis noticed the muscles tense beneath its coat, the subtle movements of breath, the way its eyes scanned constantly yet calmly. Orion followed her gaze, noting each detail, absorbing the rhythm of life within the forest. The stag eventually moved on, disappearing into the deeper woods. Artemis and Orion rose slowly, letting their presence blend back into the shadows. The hounds returned, tails low, ears attentive. The nymphs emerged, soft smiles on their faces, sensing the harmony between the goddess and the mortal. "Few hunters understand this," Artemis said quietly. "Few even try. You are different." Orion's green eyes met hers. "I have heard stories of the goddess of the hunt," he said, "but I have not expected to meet one who moves as lightly as the wind, who observes as deeply as the streams." Artemis's lips curved slightly, a rare smile. "Then you may walk beside me, Orion. Not as a companion of power, but as one who respects the wild. You may learn the ways of the hunt as I do." And so he followed her, moving through the forest with care, listening to her instructions, observing the nymphs, the hounds, and the creatures of the woods. Artemis taught him to read the signs of the forest, to notice the rustle of leaves that indicated movement, the subtle scents carried by the wind, and the tracks left by animals of every size. At dusk, they reached a stream where the water curved gently around mossy rocks. Artemis knelt, letting her hands trail through the cool water, while Orion mirrored her, feeling the current, observing the small fish that darted beneath the surface. "You feel the forest's rhythm?" Artemis asked. Orion nodded. "Yes, it speaks quietly yet clearly. One must only pause and listen." Night fell, and the moon rose over the clearing. Its silver light spilled across the forest, illuminating paths, streams, and the figures of Artemis, Orion, and the nymphs. The hounds lay at their feet, alert yet calm, their breathing steady. Artemis raised her bow once more, testing the tension of the string, feeling its familiar weight. Orion mirrored her posture, drawing his own bow, careful, measured. Together, they moved silently through the grove, observing a family of deer drinking at the stream. Artemis signaled with a subtle tilt of her head, teaching Orion to watch without interfering. Hours passed in quiet harmony. Every rustle, every shadow, every glimmer of moonlight on water became a lesson. Orion learned patience, observation, and restraint, while Artemis appreciated his respect, his quiet strength, and his willingness to understand rather than dominate. By the time the first light of dawn touched the treetops, Artemis led her companions, mortal and immortal, back to the familiar paths near Olympus. The nymphs whispered softly among themselves, recounting small lessons they had learned by watching Artemis and Orion together. The hounds padded silently, returning to their spots beside the goddess. Artemis glanced back at the distant hills, green and gold in the morning light. Orion walked beside her, silent, attentive, his green eyes reflecting the soft colors of the forest. She did not speak, for words were unnecessary. The rhythm of life, the harmony of the hunt, and the shared respect for the wild flowed naturally between them. In that moment, Artemis felt the quiet joy of companionship, not born of power or rivalry, but mutual understanding and shared reverence for the forests, the creatures, and the freedom they both cherished. The forest around them pulsed with life, streams trickling, leaves rustling, birds calling in the distance. Artemis, Orion, the nymphs, and the hounds moved as one with the rhythm of the woods, each step a continuation of the hunt, each breath a testament to patience, respect, and the delicate balance of life in the wild. The night was still, though the forest thrummed with quiet life. Moonlight spilled between the high pines, casting silver stripes across moss and fallen leaves. Artemis moved ahead, her steps silent, the hounds at her side moving in perfect rhythm. Orion followed, his own movements careful, bow held loosely but ready, eyes scanning the shadows. The nymphs followed behind, each step measured, learning from every subtle sound and shimmer of light. Artemis paused at the edge of a clearing, the soft silver glow of the moon illuminating the grass and the delicate petals of night-blooming flowers. The wind was calm, carrying the scent of pine resin, wet earth, and a faint sweetness of flowers in bloom. She knelt, trailing her fingers over the damp moss, letting it brush her skin. Her hounds sniffed the air, noses quivering at every faint trace of movement. "Tonight," she said quietly, her voice barely above the whisper of leaves, "we follow the deer that roam these high hills. Observe first, move second, strike only if necessary." The nymphs nodded, their eyes bright in the moonlight. Orion mirrored her posture, bending low, observing the clearing and the faint tracks pressed into the soft earth. Artemis rose slowly, bow in hand, eyes scanning the horizon. A faint shimmer of movement caught her gaze. A stag, tall and slender, stepped carefully across the clearing, antlers tipped with silver in the moonlight. She signaled the nymphs with a subtle tilt of her head. They fanned out quietly, following the contours of the land, blending with shadows. The hounds padded ahead, careful not to disturb the soft undergrowth. Artemis led Orion along a narrow ridge, their movements synchronized, breathing slow and steady. The stag paused near a stream, lowering its head to drink. Artemis crouched behind a fallen log, noting the subtle rhythm of its breath. Orion crouched beside her, watching closely, eyes reflecting the silver light of the moon on the water. Notice its movement, she whispered. See how it senses the forest, how it listens without turning, how it trusts its steps. Every muscle, every glance, every pause tells a story. The nymphs observed quietly, every sense attuned to the forest. One dryad pressed her palm to the earth, feeling the vibrations of movement beneath the soil. An oread crouched on a small rise, studying the pattern of broken twigs, the faint impressions of hoofs. The oceanids traced the path of the stream with their hands, listening to its murmur, noting how it curved around mossy rocks. The stag moved again, cautious yet graceful. Artemis rose slightly, drawing her bow, feeling the familiar tension of the string. The hounds remained still, eyes bright but silent. Orion mirrored her posture, bow ready but not lifted fully. Artemis exhaled slowly, letting her breath match the rhythm of the forest. The stag raised its head, nostrils flaring, eyes wide. Artemis lowered her bow. Orion followed her movement instinctively, understanding the choice without words. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. The stag moved on, stepping lightly over the stones of the stream, antlers catching faint glimmers of moonlight. Artemis watched until it disappeared into the shadowed trees. She signaled to the nymphs, and they relaxed, exhaling softly, smiles touching their lips at the lesson of patience and restraint. Artemis led them deeper into the forest, following faint tracks that twisted between pines and ferns. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet earth, moss, and distant flowers. Hints of other creatures stirred in the undergrowth. A fox darted between shadows. Rabbits paused to sniff the night air, and owls hooted softly from distant branches. Every sound, every movement became a lesson in observation. They reached a hilltop where the moonlight spilled like silver over the grass. Artemis knelt, letting her gaze travel over the valley below. The hounds circled quietly, noses close to the ground, tails low but alert. The nymphs spread out in a wide semicircle, bows resting across their shoulders, eyes scanning for motion. "Observe, Orion," Artemis said softly. "The hunt is not always about striking. It is about learning, understanding, walking in rhythm with life. See without interfering, notice without disturbing. The forest speaks if you are patient." Orion nodded, eyes scanning every shadow, every shift of movement in the moonlight. He bent low, noticing subtle patterns in the ground, small hoofprints pressed into moss, faint impressions of claws in soft soil, broken twigs that marked the passing of creatures unseen. A sudden movement drew Artemis's attention, a herd of deer moving along a distant ridge. The nymphs froze instantly, blending with shadows, eyes wide in quiet wonder. Artemis lifted her bow slowly, testing the string, feeling the pull and release that had become second nature. The hounds crouched, tails low, ready but obedient to her silent command. She gestured subtly to Orion, who mirrored her stance. Together, they followed the herd at a careful distance, stepping softly over moss and leaves, their movements synchronized, bodies low, eyes alert. The nymphs followed, moving as one with the forest, attuned to the pulse of life around them. The herd paused near a stream, drinking cautiously. Artemis and Orion observed, noting the subtle interactions, the flick of ears, the position of legs, the tilt of heads. One of the fawns stumbled lightly on a stone, and Artemis exhaled softly, letting Orion and the nymphs see the fragile rhythm of life in its movements. They watched until the herd moved on into the deeper woods. Artemis led the nymphs to a small clearing nearby, letting the hounds rest and drink from a trickling stream. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The nymphs lay down, whispering softly to each other about what they had observed. Orion knelt beside Artemis, tracing the patterns of footprints left by the deer. "There is so much to see," he murmured. "So many details I would have missed without guidance." Artemis smiled faintly, brushing her fingers along the moss. "The forest gives, but only to those who watch and listen. Patience and observation are the greatest teachers." Night deepened, and the moon rose higher, casting silver over the clearing. Artemis stood, bowing across her shoulder, eyes scanning the darkened woods. The hounds rested at her feet, muscles relaxed but alert. The nymphs mirrored her posture, breathing in rhythm with the forest, absorbing the quiet lessons of the hunt. From the ridge above, the distant howl of wolves echoed softly, mingling with the rustle of leaves and the gentle murmur of the stream. Artemis lifted her hand, signaling stillness. Every creature she taught had its own rhythm, its own voice in the wild. To hear it, one must move with care and patience without disturbing the balance. Hours passed in silence, the forest alive with nocturnal life. Every movement, every sound became a lesson in rhythm and harmony. Artemis guided Orion and the nymphs through observation, teaching them to walk as the forest walked, to breathe as the wind did, and to respect every life, large or small. When dawn finally crept over the hills, spilling gold across the forest floor, Artemis led her companions back toward familiar paths near Olympus. The hounds padded silently, noses close to the earth, and the nymphs moved with quiet reverence, still feeling the pulse of life in every step. Orion walked beside Artemis, silent, reflective, understanding the unspoken lessons of the moonlit hunt. Artemis paused at the edge of the forest, glancing back over the silvered trees and streams. The deer, the fawns, the foxes, the owls, they had all played their part in the rhythm of the night. She lifted her bow, testing the tension once more, letting the cool dawn air brush her skin. The nymphs and Orion watched, learning that every hunt was not only about pursuit or skill, but about harmony, understanding, and quiet reverence. The moonlit hunt had been more than a chase. It had been a lesson in patience, a testament to the forest's voice, and a shared rhythm of life that connected goddess, mortal, and wild alike. The forest held its breath as Artemis, Orion, the nymphs, and the hounds moved together toward the hills of Olympus, the first light of morning gilding the edges of trees, stones, and streams. Life in the woods pulsed quietly, steadily, and they walked within it, part of the rhythm, part of the song of the moonlit hunt. The wind was soft that evening, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth through the quiet valleys near Olympus. Artemis moved alone at first, her hounds trailing behind, paws brushing the soft moss with careful grace. The nymphs had paused near a stream to rest, but she felt the pull of the forest beyond, where shadows stretched between ancient oaks and silvered birches. Her bow rested lightly across her shoulder, a familiar weight, yet tonight it felt different, as if the forest itself awaited her. The sacred bough lay hidden in a grove deep within the woods, a place untouched by mortal or godly hands for generations. Its wood was said to be born of the oldest oak in the world, tempered with silver from the streams of the highest mountains. Artemis had felt its call before, a gentle tug in her chest, like a heartbeat echoing through the forest. Tonight she followed it. The moon rose full, spilling silver across the leaves, turning shadows into pools of soft light. The hounds led her through winding paths, sniffing faint traces of deer and hare, yet careful not to disturb the deeper silence of the grove. Artemis stepped lightly, bow in hand, eyes alert to the whispers of trees, the flow of water, and the rustle of small creatures hidden in shadows. Finally, she reached a clearing where the ground was carpeted with soft moss and wildflowers that glimmered in the moonlight. In the center stood the sacred bough, resting against a stone carved with faint, ancient runes. Its wood gleamed pale and golden, the string taut yet gentle, humming faintly as if alive. Artemis approached slowly, her breath steady, heart calm. The hounds lay quietly behind her, ears pricked, eyes reflecting the moon. Artemis knelt and brushed her fingers over the bough, feeling its warmth, its energy, the subtle pulse of life contained within it. She lifted it gently, testing its weight. Every curve, every grain, every silvered line felt as though it had been waiting for her touch. "Long have you waited," she whispered softly, the words carried lightly by the wind. Her voice mingled with the rustle of leaves and the faint murmur of a distant stream. She drew the string back carefully, letting it hum with perfect tension. The bough seemed to respond, a quiet resonance that matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. The forest shifted around her. Deer lifted their heads in distant clearings, watching quietly. A fox paused mid-step, ears pricked, as though recognizing the presence of something sacred. The nymphs remained hidden, their eyes wide in awe, sensing the power of the moment without daring to interrupt. Artemis released the string, letting it hum through the night. The bough sang, a clear silver note that lingered in the air, weaving through the trees and over moss. The hounds stirred slightly, noses lifting as the sound brushed their ears. The forest seemed to exhale, a quiet acceptance of the sacred ritual. She drew another arrow, notched it lightly, and let it fly across the clearing. It struck a mark perfectly carved into the stone floor, and Artemis exhaled, feeling the calm energy settle within her. She knelt again, touching the bow and tracing the silver lines with her fingers. This bow was more than a weapon. It was an extension of the forest, a conduit of patience, precision, and respect. Orion stepped forward from the shadows, careful not to startle the hounds. "It is beautiful," he murmured. His voice carried respect, awe, and quiet wonder. "I have never seen a bow like it." Artemis looked up at him, eyes reflecting the silvered moonlight. "It is as old as the forest itself," she said softly. "It teaches those who use it to move with care, to observe before acting, and to honor every life that shares the woods." Orion knelt beside her, eyes tracing the fine lines carved into the wood, feeling the energy that hummed faintly beneath his fingers. "Does it choose the hunter, or the hunter chooses it?" he asked quietly. "It chooses," Artemis replied, running her hand along the string. "Not by strength nor skill, but by patience, respect, and understanding. Those who rush, who take without thought, will find it silent. Those who walk in the forest will hear its song." The nymphs stepped forward slowly, bowing their heads slightly, feeling the hum of the sacred bough ripple through the grove. Artemis motioned for them to kneel and watch. She drew another arrow, letting it fly, tracing a perfect arc through the moonlight and striking the carved mark with a quiet thump. "You must understand the rhythm," she whispered to Orion. "The pull of the string, the weight of the arrow, the flight through the air. It is not just force. It is harmony. Listen to the world, and the bow will guide your hand." Orion lifted his bow, a smaller weapon of plain wood, and mirrored her movements. He notched an arrow, drew slowly, letting his breath and pulse synchronize with the night around him. The arrow flew, striking a nearby tree with a soft thud. Artemis smiled faintly, nodding in approval. "Good," she said softly. "You are learning not only the way of the bough, but the way of the forest. Every motion has meaning. Every step, every breath, every glance matters." The hounds padded around the clearing, sniffing at the moss and flowers, tails low and gentle. Artemis reached out to one, brushing its head and letting it nuzzle her hand. Orion mirrored the gesture with the hound nearest him, feeling the warmth and trust of the animals that moved with them through the woods. Night deepened, and Artemis drew several more arrows, each finding its mark in the moonlight. The forest seemed to hum with quiet energy, every leaf, stone, and stream holding the resonance of the sacred bough. Orion followed her movements, adjusting his stance, feeling the rhythm, learning the delicate balance of tension and release. A gentle wind swept through the clearing, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, rustling the leaves above. Artemis paused, bow in hand, listening to the forest's quiet song. The hounds lay at her feet, breathing steady. Orion knelt nearby, eyes closed, absorbing the rhythm, feeling the quiet power of the night settle into his bones. Artemis spoke softly, not as instruction, but as reflection. "The bow is not only in your hands. It is in your heart, in your awareness, in every breath you take. The forest, the hounds, the nymphs, they are all part of this rhythm. To move without thought is to break it. To move with care is to honor it." Orion opened his eyes and looked at her, a quiet understanding in his gaze. "I feel it," he said softly. "The weight of life, the pull of every arrow, the song of the forest. It is more than hunting. It is listening and learning and moving as one with the world." Artemis lowered the sacred bough to rest across her shoulder, letting its silver wood catch the pale light of the moon. She knelt briefly beside the carved mark in the moss, tracing its edges with a careful finger, then stood, gesturing for Orion and the nymphs to rise. The nymphs stepped back, eyes wide, breathing quietly, absorbing the sacred atmosphere of the grove. Artemis motioned for Orion to walk beside her, and together they moved toward the edge of the clearing. The hounds followed, noses brushing the moss, ears alert, tails low. As they reached the forest's edge, the first light of dawn began to touch the treetops, painting them in gold and silver. Artemis glanced back at the grove, feeling the pulse of the sacred bough, the rhythm of life it carried, and the harmony of the forest itself. Orion walked beside her, quiet, thoughtful, and attentive, understanding the lessons not in words but in presence, movement, and care. The sacred bough would remain in its grove, waiting for those who approached with patience and respect, and Artemis knew that its song would continue to guide her, her companions, and Orion in the hunts to come. Every arrow, every step, every breath through the forest would carry the harmony of the sacred bough, a bond between hunter, forest, and life itself. And as the sun rose higher, spilling warm light across the moss, leaves, and streams, Artemis and her companions moved onward, their hearts attuned to the quiet rhythm of the forest, the sacred bough humming faintly in memory, a song of patience, respect, and harmony that would echo through every hunt, every night, and every step of their lives. The sky blushed faint pink and gold as the first light of dawn crept over the distant hills. Artemis moved silently through the forest, her bow across her shoulder, hounds padding close, ears alert to the soft stirrings of morning. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine, wildflowers, and damp earth, mingled with the distant tang of the sea. Dew clung to the moss, sparkling faintly in the light that filtered through the tall pines and oaks. The nymphs followed quietly, each step careful, bow in hand, eyes scanning for the subtle signs of movement among leaves, roots, and stones. Orion walked beside Artemis, moving with measured steps, adjusting his pace to match the rhythm of the forest. The hounds led the way, noses to the ground, tails low, muscles coiled yet relaxed. They reached a clearing where a small stream curved gently around mossy rocks. The water rippled softly, reflecting the emerging light of dawn. Artemis knelt beside it, letting her fingers trail through the cool liquid. The hounds sniffed the air, tails flicking gently, ears pricked. The nymphs gathered around, observing the reflections, the patterns of sunlight on the water, the gentle motion of ripples and currents. "Observe the world before you move through it," Artemis whispered. "Every shadow, every movement, every sound carries meaning. The hunt is not only about the prey, it is about understanding the forest, the creatures, and yourself." Orion crouched beside her, tracing faint tracks pressed into the soft soil along the stream's edge. Tiny hooves, claws, and impressions of leaves told the story of nocturnal life. "I see," he said softly. "The forest moves quietly, but it leaves traces for those who watch." Artemis nodded, eyes scanning the clearing. "Patience, Orion. The morning is just beginning. The deer, the hares, and the birds will emerge soon. We must move with care." A faint rustle from the underbrush drew her attention. A young fawn stepped into the clearing, followed closely by its mother. Artemis held her breath, bow at rest, eyes soft and steady. The fawn paused, sniffing the air, then moved toward the stream to drink. Artemis signaled the nymphs with a subtle tilt of her head, stillness, observation, respect. The mother deer lifted her head, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. She did not flee, sensing the calm presence of Artemis and her companions. The hounds remained quietly at the goddess's side, tails low, muscles relaxed yet attentive. Orion mirrored her stance, watching, learning the delicate rhythm of approach and restraint. "Notice their steps," Artemis whispered. "The fawn moves with curiosity, but trust. The mother moves with caution, but confidence. There is a balance here. Observe it, respect it, and learn from it." The fawn dipped its head to drink, ears flicking at every sound. Artemis traced the movements of its legs, the rise and fall of its small chest, a subtle tension in its muscles. Orion followed, noting each detail, his green eyes reflecting the pale light of dawn. A rabbit darted across the clearing, ears back, nose twitching. The fawn lifted its head, startled briefly, then relaxed again as the rabbit disappeared into the undergrowth. Artemis exhaled softly, letting the nymphs feel the rhythm of life in the forest, the way every movement affected another, the delicate web of life that connected every creature. "Every step matters," she murmured. "Every breath, every glance, every choice to pause or move carries consequences. The hunt is not only about skill, it is about understanding, patience, and harmony." The nymphs mirrored her stance, watching intently as the mother deer and fawn moved through the clearing, blending with shadows, their movements synchronized with the forest around them. The hounds remained still, breathing steady, tails low, ears flicking at the faintest rustle. Artemis led Orion and the nymphs along a narrow ridge, following the trail of the deer from a respectful distance. Sunlight spilled through the trees, painting gold in the moss and leaves. The air was alive with subtle scents, the tang of pine, the sweetness of wildflowers, the faint musk of animals that had passed through in the night. They reached a small glade where a larger herd of deer grazed quietly. Artemis knelt behind a fallen log, signaling Orion to follow her posture. The nymphs crouched nearby, breathing slow and steady, eyes wide and quiet. "See how they move together," Artemis whispered. "Notice the pauses, the glances, the gentle nudges. They communicate silently, understanding one another without words. This is the rhythm of life." Orion observed intently, noting the subtle interactions. One stag lowered its antlers, grazing slowly, while a doe nuzzled her fawn. Another young deer lifted its head, sniffing the air before moving closer to its mother. Every detail mattered: the angle of an ear, the flex of a muscle, the slight shift of weight. Artemis drew an arrow, testing the tension of her bow. She did not intend to strike. Instead, she let the arrow hum gently through the air, feeling the rhythm of the forest, the pulse of life, the harmony between predator and prey. Orion mirrored her, drawing his own bow and releasing, allowing the arrow to strike a soft mark on a nearby tree, a reminder of balance and control. The herd moved slowly, unbothered by their presence. Artemis and Orion followed quietly, teaching the nymphs to move with care, to step lightly, to breathe in rhythm with the forest. Every sound, the babble of a stream, the rustle of leaves, the soft snap of twigs, became a lesson in observation, patience, and harmony. Hours passed in this quiet pursuit. The sun rose higher, spilling warmth and light across the clearing. Artemis led her companions to a small hilltop overlooking the valley, where streams curved like silver ribbons and trees stretched wide, shadows long in the morning light. The deer grazed below, their movements steady and calm. "Do you feel it?" Artemis asked Orion softly. The forest, the herd, the hounds, the nymphs, they all move together. We are part of this rhythm, not above it, not separate from it. Observe, understand, and respect, and the forest will guide you. Orion nodded, eyes bright with quiet understanding. "I feel it. The balance, the connection. Every step matters. Every glance, every choice. I understand why you move as you do." Artemis smiled faintly, letting the hound stretch and yawn. The nymphs knelt, touching the moss and stones, listening to the whispers of the forest, feeling the subtle pulse of life beneath their hands. A fox appeared briefly on the distant ridge, pausing to sniff the morning air before darting back into the shadows. Artemis and Orion watched, noting the alertness and care in its movements. "All creatures are teachers," she said softly. "Every movement, every choice, every breath has a lesson. Watch, learn, and honor it." By mid-morning, Artemis led her companions back through the forest paths, the hounds padding quietly behind, noses close to the earth. The nymphs moved with quiet reverence, whispering among themselves, recounting small lessons, subtle observations, and the rhythms of the morning hunt. Orion walked beside Artemis, silent, reflective, aware of the harmony of the forest and the quiet joy of moving within it. The first light of day cast gold across moss, leaves, and streams, illuminating the delicate balance of life in the forest. Artemis paused at the edge of a clearing, glancing back. The deer moved on, unseen now, blending with the deeper woods. The hounds rested at her feet, tails low, ears pricked. The nymphs knelt quietly, absorbing the lessons of observation, patience, and restraint. Orion mirrored her gaze, feeling the forest pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. "The hunt is never only about pursuit," Artemis said softly. "It is about understanding, patience, and the quiet joy of moving within life's rhythm. Each step, each breath, each glance is part of the forest's song." The nymphs nodded, faces serene, eyes wide with wonder. Orion exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her words, not as instruction, but as living truth. The hounds stirred slightly, noses brushing the moss, tails flicking lightly in contentment. As the sun climbed higher, Artemis led her companions back to the paths near Olympus, leaving the hidden clearings, streams, and deer to the quiet of the morning. The forest shimmered in the light, alive with birdsong, rustling leaves, and the faint murmur of streams. Artemis, Orion, the nymphs, and the hounds moved together as one, part of the rhythm, part of the song of the forest, carrying with them the quiet lessons of the moonlit hunt and the dawn hunt alike. Every step, every breath, Every glance was a continuation of life's harmony, a connection between goddess, mortal, and the untamed wild. The morning light filtered through the tall pines, touching the forest floor with pale gold. Artemis moved along a winding path, the soft moss cushioning her steps, the hounds trailing behind her with silent grace. The nymphs followed, bows slung lightly across their shoulders, eyes scanning the ground and sky for the faintest signs of life. The air was cool and carried the scent of pine resin, wet earth, and the subtle sweetness of early blooming flowers. They reached a narrow stream that curved gently through the valley, water clear and cold as it rushed over smooth stones. Sunlight danced on the surface, scattering silver light across the surrounding ferns and mossy rocks. Artemis knelt, dipping her fingers into the water, feeling its pulse, the way it carried the stories of distant hills and hidden springs. "Here," she said softly, "we meet the river nymphs. They move with the flow of water, teaching patience, adaptability, and quiet observation. They are guardians of life in the streams, and their presence guides us as much as the forest itself." The nymphs murmured softly, eyes wide, as Artemis motioned for them to kneel beside the stream. She dipped a hand into the current and traced its path, feeling the smooth flow over rocks and roots. Small fish darted beneath her fingers, shimmering like tiny fragments of sunlight. The hounds stepped carefully, noses to the ground, ears alert to every ripple in the water. A gentle laugh echoed from downstream, clear and light, carrying with it the glimmer of water droplets. Artemis smiled faintly, knowing the river nymphs had arrived. One emerged first, her hair dark and wet, eyes reflecting the sun and water like liquid gold. She stepped carefully across the stones, moving with the grace of the current itself. "Welcome, Artemis," the nymph said, her voice flowing like the stream. "We have watched your path and the care you bring to all living things. It is rare to meet a goddess who walks so lightly." Artemis inclined her head. "I seek understanding, not dominance," she replied. "I move with the forest, the hounds, the creatures, and with those who guide the waters. Teach me, and the nymphs, how to honor the streams and the life they carry." Another nymph stepped forward, smaller and delicate, hair braided with strands of moss and tiny blossoms. She touched the water gently, sending ripples outward that reflected sunlight and faint rainbows. "The water teaches rhythm," she said softly. "It listens, it flows, it adapts. All who follow must learn its patience and its persistence." Artemis nodded, kneeling beside the nymphs. The hounds lowered themselves to drink from the stream, careful not to disturb the flow. The nymphs gestured for Artemis and Orion to move along the bank, tracing the curve of the water, observing the patterns of stones, currents, and small creatures hidden in the shallows. "Notice the fish," Artemis whispered to Orion. "Their movements are not random. Each follows the rhythm of the water, the bends and eddies, the rise and fall of the current. To hunt here is to understand, not to strike." Orion crouched, studying the movements of a small school of fish. Their silver scales glimmered in the sunlight, reflecting the green of the trees above. "It is like the forest," he murmured. "Every ripple, every step, every shift in light tells a story." The river nymphs guided them further along the stream, showing hidden pools where frogs rested, stones smoothed by years of flowing water, and delicate flowers that grew only at the water's edge. Artemis knelt beside a pool, letting her fingers trace the rippling surface. The water seemed to hum faintly under her touch, a gentle resonance that spoke of patience, balance, and life sustained through quiet persistence. "Every creature depends on this flow," Artemis said softly. "The fish, the frogs, the insects, the plants, they all rely on the rhythm of the water. And we must respect it, move within it, not against it." The nymphs guided them to a wider pool, where sunlight touched the water in pale gold. Artemis and Orion knelt, observing a small family of otters playing near the surface, diving and surfacing in smooth arcs. The hounds lay quietly, eyes bright but bodies relaxed. The nymphs whispered among themselves, noting subtle movements of leaves and ripples that told stories of the life hidden beneath the water. Artemis drew her bow slowly, not to strike, but to teach observation. She notched an arrow lightly, aiming at a faint mark on a mossy stone across the water. Orion mirrored her, bow held carefully, drawing the string with slow precision. Together, they released, letting arrows strike their marks without harming any creature. The arrows hummed, and the water reflected their flight in shimmering patterns. "You feel the rhythm of life," Artemis whispered. "The water, the forest, the creatures, the hounds, the nymphs. We all move together. Listen, observe, and move as one." Orion nodded, eyes reflecting the sunlight on the water. "It is more than hunting," he said softly. "It is learning, understanding, moving in harmony." Artemis smiled faintly, brushing water from her hands. "Yes, the hunt is never only pursuit. It is awareness, respect, and quiet patience." The nymphs led them further downstream to a narrow waterfall, its water spilling over moss-covered rocks with a gentle roar. The mist hung in the air, cool against the skin, carrying the scent of fresh water and wet stones. Artemis traced her fingers along the smooth rocks, feeling the flow and force of the water. The hounds sniffed at the mist, tails flicking softly, bodies relaxed. "Water moves without hurry," one nymph said softly, stepping lightly on a rock to balance. "It does not force its way. It listens, flows, and adapts. So must all who walk beside it." Artemis knelt, letting her hands follow the edges of the waterfall's pool. Orion mirrored her, tracing the water's flow with fingers grazing the surface. "It teaches persistence," Artemis murmured. "Gentle, steady, relentless without harm. That is the way of the river and the way of the hunt that honors life." They spent hours moving along the stream, observing and learning. Fish darted beneath their hands, frogs leapt between rocks, and water insects traced delicate arcs across the surface. Every ripple, every curve, every sound became a lesson in patience, harmony, and careful observation. The nymphs whispered, pointing out small details, the way sunlight touched ripples, how shadows shifted over stones, and how leaves floated gently with the current. As the sun climbed higher, Artemis led them to a secluded pool where the water ran still and deep, reflecting the sky above. She knelt, letting the hounds drink quietly, while the nymphs observed and mirrored her reverent movements. Orion followed, tracing patterns in the water, absorbing the lessons of observation, patience, and gentle respect. "The river nymphs teach us more than swimming, fishing, or tracking," Artemis said softly. "They teach flow, patience, awareness, and respect. Life moves like water, sometimes still, sometimes swift, always carrying stories and sustaining every creature." The nymphs nodded, faces serene, eyes reflecting the sunlight on the water. Orion exhaled slowly, feeling the rhythm of the stream pulse through him. The hounds lay quietly, ears flicking at soft movements in the undergrowth. Artemis stood, bow resting lightly across her shoulder, and motioned for them to move along the final stretch of the stream. They emerged from the valley into a small clearing where the stream widened into a gentle pond. The water shimmered in the sunlight, carrying the reflections of trees, flowers, and sky. Artemis and Orion paused, observing the entire stretch they had walked. The flow of life, the harmony of movement, the quiet rhythm of existence. "The river nymphs will always guide this stream," Artemis said softly. "We walk within their song, observe, learn, and move as part of it. Every creature, every ripple, every breath is part of the same rhythm." Orion nodded, eyes bright with understanding and quiet wonder. The hounds stirred lightly, tails flicking, breathing steady. The nymphs knelt, absorbing the flow, the lessons of patience, and the harmony of the river. Artemis touched the water one last time, feeling its pulse, and led her companions back along the mossy path, leaving the river nymphs to their gentle guardianship. As they moved away from the stream, the forest seemed to exhale, carrying the sounds of flowing water, rustling leaves, and distant birdsong. Artemis, Orion, the nymphs, and the hounds moved together, part of the rhythm, part of the harmony of life, each step a continuation of the quiet lessons learned from the rivers, the forest, and the sacred hunt. Artemis moved through the forest with light, deliberate steps. The hounds padded at her side, tails low, ears alert to every rustle of leaves and crack of twigs. Orion followed quietly, adjusting his stride to match hers, bow resting lightly across his shoulder. The nymphs trailed behind, careful to remain within the rhythm of the forest, eyes scanning for the slightest shift in light or shadow. The path led them to a narrow valley, where the sunlight barely reached the forest floor, filtering through tall pines and oaks to touch the moss in faint golden streaks. A subtle fragrance hung in the air, damp earth, pine resin, and wildflowers hidden among ferns. Artemis paused, listening to the gentle murmur of a stream far below, feeling the pulse of life in every stone, every leaf, every curve of the land. Orion crouched beside her, studying a trail of prints pressed into the moss. "Do you feel it?" he asked softly. "Something different about this place." Artemis nodded, her eyes scanning the undergrowth. "The forest speaks quietly here," she said. "The creatures move with care, and the glade waits for those who notice it." A faint rustle came from deeper in the valley. Artemis raised her hand, the signal for stillness. The nymphs knelt behind her, breath slow and measured. The hounds lowered themselves to the ground, noses brushing moss, eyes bright and attentive. A small family of deer emerged from behind the trees, moving cautiously toward the stream. The fawns stayed close to their mothers, ears flicking at every sound. Artemis drew her bow slowly, testing the tension of the string. Her movements were precise, careful, deliberate. Orion mirrored her stance, drawing his own bow lightly, watching as she released an arrow, not toward the deer, but at a target carved into a nearby tree. The arrow struck cleanly, and Artemis exhaled softly, releasing the tension from her shoulders. The deer moved on, unbothered, blending with the shadows. Artemis stood, motioning for Orion and the nymphs to rise. She stepped lightly across the moss, following the faint path of the stream, every movement deliberate, blending with the rhythm of the glade. They reached a small clearing surrounded by tall oaks, their branches forming a natural canopy overhead. Sunlight spilled through in scattered beams, illuminating patches of moss and clusters of wildflowers. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, and the soft hum of insects filled the air. A doe stepped from the shadows, pausing to sniff the morning air. Artemis knelt, letting the hound settle beside her. The doe glanced at her, ears flicking, eyes wide, then moved slowly toward the stream at the center of the glade. A fawn followed, stepping carefully over stones and moss. Orion crouched beside her, tracing the movements of the deer with careful attention. "They trust this place," he whispered. "They feel safe here." Artemis nodded, her fingers brushing the moss at her feet. "They sense the rhythm of life here," she said. "The glade moves with care, and those who enter it must respect its balance." The nymphs stepped closer to the edge of the clearing, observing the subtle movements of leaves and shadows. One dryad touched a cluster of moss, feeling the delicate heartbeat of the forest beneath her fingers. Another oread knelt near a fallen branch, tracing the patterns of lichen and small insects that had moved along its surface. Artemis drew an arrow lightly, notching it with care. She aimed at a mark on a tree, testing her focus and precision. The arrow struck, and the faint vibration of its impact echoed through the glade. Orion mirrored her, releasing his own arrow into a similar target, feeling the rhythm of the bow in his hands. A small fox appeared at the edge of the clearing, stepping softly over moss and roots. It paused, sniffing the air, and watched Artemis and Orion. The hounds remained still, eyes bright, muscles relaxed. The fox darted to a shadowed patch of ferns, disappearing from view. Artemis exhaled softly, letting her shoulders relax. They moved slowly through the glade, following a faint trail that twisted between moss-covered stones and clusters of wildflowers. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the ground. The hounds padded quietly, noses brushing the earth, tails low. Orion stepped carefully, adjusting his weight to move silently over roots and rocks. They reached a pool fed by the small stream, water clear and still, reflecting the canopy above. Artemis knelt, letting her fingers touch the surface. Ripples spread outward, catching sunlight in faint patterns. A dragonfly hovered briefly above the water, wings shimmering in the light, before darting toward a cluster of reeds. Artemis smiled faintly, motioning for Orion and the nymphs to kneel beside her. "Every creature has its rhythm," she whispered. The deer, the fox, the dragonfly, the fish beneath the water, they all move within the same pulse. To walk in the glade is to follow that rhythm, to honor it with patience and care. Orion crouched, observing the pool. He traced the movements of small fish beneath the water, noting the way they adjusted their path around pebbles and fallen leaves. "It is like the forest," he murmured. "Every step, every glance, every breath affects another." Artemis nodded, letting her hand skim the water. "Yes, the glade is alive. Every movement carries weight, every pause carries meaning. To hunt, to move, to live here is to understand that connection." They spent hours in the glade, moving carefully, observing every ripple, shadow, and movement. The hounds lay quietly at their feet, tails low, breathing steady. The nymphs followed Artemis's lead, tracing subtle patterns in moss, leaves, and stones. Orion mirrored her movements, absorbing the lessons in quiet observation, patience, and restraint. A gentle breeze swept through the glade, carrying the scent of wildflowers and damp earth. Artemis stood, bowed across her shoulder, and motioned for Orion and the nymphs to rise. They moved toward the edge of the clearing, stepping lightly over moss and roots. The hounds followed, noses brushing the ground, ears alert. At the far side of the glade, sunlight spilled over a small hill, illuminating a faint path lined with wildflowers. Artemis led her companions along the trail, careful to disturb neither moss nor leaves. A doe and fawn watched from the shadows, pausing briefly before disappearing deeper into the forest. Orion glanced back at the glade, green eyes reflecting the sunlight on moss and leaves. "It is peaceful here," he said softly, "and yet alive. Every movement feels meaningful." Artemis smiled faintly. "That is the glade. It teaches more than hunting or observation. It teaches connection, awareness, and respect. To walk here is to feel the rhythm of life itself." The nymphs murmured quietly, touching moss and leaves, absorbing the pulse of the glade. The hounds pat ahead, tails low, ears flicking at the faintest sound. Artemis led the group up the hill, sunlight warming their skin, leaves rustling softly overhead. They emerged onto a wider path that led deeper into the forest. The glade remained behind, its moss, stones, and water shining in the morning light. Artemis glanced back once, feeling the quiet presence of life lingering there. The deer, the foxes, the dragonflies, the water itself. Orion walked beside her, silent, reflective, aware of the lessons in the glade. The hounds followed at a steady pace, noses brushing the earth, ears alert. The nymphs moved quietly behind, still feeling the pulse of life, the rhythm of connection, and the delicate balance that governed every step within the hidden glade. As they moved onward, the sun climbed higher, spilling gold over trees, streams, and moss. Artemis led her companions through winding paths, every movement deliberate, every breath in harmony with the forest. The hidden glade remained their memory, a place of quiet understanding, gentle lessons, and the pure rhythm of life that guided them with every step. The sky above the forest shifted to soft purples and muted golds as twilight approached. Artemis moved with quiet certainty, bow in hand, hounds following her with careful grace. The forest seemed to soften in the fading light, leaves brushing gently against one another, streams reflecting the dim glow of the sky. Orion trailed beside her, steps measured, eyes alert to subtle movements in the shadows. The nymphs followed behind, their bows slung lightly across their shoulders, ears attuned to every faint sound. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, mixing with the earthy aroma of damp soil. Artemis inhaled deeply, feeling the rhythm of the forest shift with the setting sun, sensing the movement of creatures hidden among trees and ferns. They reached a narrow clearing where fireflies began to appear, hovering in golden arcs above moss and flowers. Artemis knelt, letting the hound settle at her sides. The fireflies rose and fell, tracing gentle patterns in the dimming light, and the nymphs crouched to watch, enchanted by the quiet display. "Twilight teaches subtlety," Artemis whispered, her voice blending with the hum of the forest. "It is a time when creatures move carefully, when shadows carry meaning, and when patience is most necessary." Orion crouched beside her, tracing faint tracks pressed into the moss. A small deer had passed moments ago, its hooves leaving barely visible impressions. Artemis gestured toward the tracks, letting him follow the rhythm of movement, the subtle shifts in weight and pressure. "See how it moved," she murmured. "Every step tells a story. Its pause, its glance, its choice of path, all of it carries meaning. To walk in twilight is to read those stories without disturbing them." A faint rustle came from the edge of the clearing. Artemis and Orion froze, hounds lowering their heads, ears pricked. A fox emerged, moving cautiously across the moss, its fur catching the fading light. It paused, sniffing the air, before darting into the shadows. Artemis exhaled softly, letting the tension ease from her shoulders. The nymphs followed her movement as she led them along a narrow ridge above a small stream. Twilight deepened, shadows stretching long across moss-covered stones and wildflowers. Artemis moved with deliberate steps, bow lightly drawn, eyes scanning for the softest signs of life. Orion mirrored her stance, adjusting his weight to stay silent, attentive to every subtle sound. They reached a glade where a small herd of deer grazed quietly. Artemis knelt behind a fallen log, signaling the nymphs to follow. The hounds lowered themselves to the ground, tails flicking softly, muscles relaxed yet alert. The deer lifted their heads, ears flicking, nostrils flaring at the faint scent of visitors. Artemis's gaze met theirs, steady and calm, and they resumed grazing, trusting her presence. "Twilight softens the forest," she whispered to Orion. "It is a time of learning, of watching, of understanding the connections between every creature. Move carefully, and the forest will guide you." Orion drew an arrow lightly, notching it without tension, and let it fly toward a faint mark on a nearby tree. The arrow struck cleanly. Artemis nodded approvingly, drawing another arrow herself, letting it hum through the air before landing with gentle precision. A deer fawn stepped towards Mother, moving carefully over moss and roots. Artemis lowered her bow, motioning for Orion and the nymphs to do the same. She reached out lightly to touch the moss, feeling the subtle vibration of life in the glade. The hound settled quietly, breathing steady. The nymphs knelt beside her, tracing patterns in leaves and stones, observing the delicate movements of insects and small animals hidden in the shadows. Orion crouched beside them, noting the rhythm of the fawn's steps, the slight sway of branches in a breeze, and the quiet flow of the stream nearby. Artemis led them further along the ridge, following a narrow path that curved through the trees. Twilight deepened, casting soft purples and silvers over moss, ferns, and wildflowers. The air cooled slightly, carrying the scent of pine, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of evening blooms. They reached a small waterfall, water spilling over stones into a still pool below. The mist rose, cool against the skin, and fireflies hovered near the surface, their lights mirrored in the water. Artemis knelt at the edge, letting her fingers touch the rippling surface. Orion mirrored her, tracing patterns in the water with gentle movements. "The forest at twilight is alive in quiet ways," Artemis murmured. "Every ripple, every leaf, every sound carries the pulse of life. Observe, understand, and move in harmony with it." A bat flew silently above the pool, tracing arcs in the fading light. Artemis watched, following its movement with her eyes. Orion mirrored her, noting the subtle shifts in shadows and the gentle flutter of wings. The nymphs crouched nearby, absorbing the rhythm of the evening, feeling the delicate balance of predator, prey, and observer. They moved slowly, carefully, along the stream, following the faint tracks of deer and small mammals. The hounds padded quietly, noses to the ground, ears alert. Artemis guided Orion and the nymphs, teaching them to notice the softest signs, the rustle of leaves, the shimmer of water, the faint scent of life passing through the glade. A fox appeared at the far edge of the stream, stepping lightly over moss and roots. It paused, watching Artemis and Orion, before disappearing into the shadows. Artemis exhaled softly, lowering her bow. Orion mirrored her stance, feeling the quiet energy of the forest around him. They reached a small clearing where wildflowers glimmered faintly in the twilight. Artemis knelt, letting her fingers brush the petals and moss, feeling the pulse of life beneath her hands. The nymphs followed, tracing subtle patterns in leaves, petals, and stones. Orion crouched beside them, absorbing the quiet lessons of observation, patience, and respect. The hounds lay quietly at their feet, breathing steady, ears flicking at the faintest sound. Artemis drew an arrow lightly, testing her focus, then released it toward a faint mark on a nearby tree. Orion followed, releasing his arrow with careful precision. The arrow struck, the subtle hum of their impact echoing through the glade. A gentle breeze stirred the trees, rustling leaves and carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and damp earth. Artemis stood, bow resting across her shoulder, motioning for Orion and the nymphs to rise. They moved toward the far edge of the clearing, stepping lightly over moss and roots. The hounds followed, tails low, ears alert. At the edge of the forest, twilight softened into a deep blue. Stars began to shimmer faintly above the treetops. Artemis paused, bowing across her shoulder, feeling the rhythm of the forest settle around her. Orion stood beside her, eyes reflecting the dim glow of stars and the faint light of the moon. The nymphs knelt quietly, absorbing the pulse of life in the glade, the subtle movements of animals, the delicate balance of predator, prey, and observer. The hounds rested at their feet, tails flicking softly, ears alert to every faint sound. Artemis exhaled softly, allowing the tension to leave her shoulders. She led her companions along a narrow path back into the deeper forest, the sound of leaves and soft trickling water accompanying their steps. Twilight deepened around them, stars reflected in streams and on mossy stones, and the gentle rhythm of the forest guided every movement. Orion followed silently, stepping lightly, adjusting his pace to match Artemis's. The nymphs mirrored their movements, breathing in the harmony of the forest, feeling the pulse of life in every leaf, every stone, every creature passing through the shadows. A distant owl called from a high branch, its voice carrying across the twilight clearing. Artemis paused, listening, then nodded slightly. They moved on, deeper into the forest, following a trail that glimmered faintly in moonlight. The hounds padded quietly, ears flicking, noses brushing moss and stones. Every step, every glance, every breath became part of the forest's rhythm, part of the quiet pulse of life in twilight. Artemis led them onward, Orion attentive, the nymphs silent, and the hounds calm yet alert. The forest seemed to exhale around them, shadows shifting, streams glimmering, and the world settling into the quiet song of evening. By the time they reached a small glade with a still pool, the moon hung high above, silver and calm. Artemis knelt, letting her fingers trace the surface of the water, observing the reflection of trees, stars, and the soft movements of small fish beneath. Orion knelt beside her, breathing slow, attentive, absorbed in the quiet lessons of the twilight hunt. The hounds lay quietly at their feet, tails low, ears flicking at faint sounds. The nymphs observed the water and moss, tracing subtle patterns, feeling the rhythm of life in every ripple, shadow, and rustle. Artemis exhaled softly, rising and motioning for Orion and the nymphs to follow her along the path back into the forest. The twilight hunt continued, silent, harmonious, and precise. Every movement a lesson in observation, patience, and connection. Every breath in tune with the pulse of life in the forest, the creatures, and the streams they passed. The forest lay quiet beneath the silver glow of the full moon. Artemis moved softly, bowing across her shoulder, the hounds padding beside her with alert yet calm steps. Orion followed, green eyes reflecting the moonlight, careful to match the rhythm of her movement. The nymphs trailed behind, careful not to disturb the quiet pulse of the night. The path led them to a clearing where the moonlight fell like a pale veil, touching moss, ferns, and scattered wildflowers. Dew shimmered faintly on leaves, each droplet catching the light and scattering it like tiny stars. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine, wildflowers, and cool earth, brushing softly against skin and fur. Artemis paused, letting her fingers trace the patterns in the moss beneath her knees. "This glade is rare," she murmured, her voice blending with the soft rustle of leaves. "It holds the quiet song of the forest, preserved in the moonlight. Those who enter it with respect will carry its calm with them." Orion crouched beside her, tracing faint animal tracks in the moss, following the rhythm of small creatures that moved only in silence. "It feels alive," he whispered. "Every step, every shadow, every sound, it matters here." A doe stepped into the clearing, followed closely by her fawn. Their movements were slow, deliberate, gentle, as if the moon itself guided them. Artemis lowered her bow, letting the hound settle at her sides. The deer paused near a small pool at the center of the glade, drinking softly, then looking up, ears flicking at the faint sounds of footsteps and rustling leaves. The nymphs knelt quietly behind her, hands tracing the soft moss, observing the gentle ripple of the water, the delicate patterns of petals scattered across the glade. Orion mirrored Artemis, kneeling, letting the quiet of the forest fill him, feeling the rhythm of life pulse beneath each stone, each leaf, each drop of dew. A silver fox appeared at the edge of the glade, stepping lightly, eyes reflecting the moon. It paused, watching Artemis and Orion, then moved gracefully along the shadows, disappearing into the trees. Artemis exhaled softly, letting her shoulders relax, sensing the harmony of the night settle around them. The pool at the center of the clearing shimmered, reflecting the moon above and the faint sparkle of stars. Artemis knelt beside it, letting her fingers brush the surface. Small fish darted beneath her touch, silver flashes in the dim light. The nymphs observed closely, tracing patterns in leaves and moss, listening to the soft murmur of the water. Orion followed, letting his hands feel the cool surface, aware of the quiet life moving beneath. Artemis whispered, "Every creature, every drop of water, every leaf, this glade carries the harmony of the forest. To walk here is to honor it, to be part of it, not above it." A gentle breeze stirred, carrying the soft scent of pine, moss, and wildflowers. The leaves whispered faintly, brushing against one another, rustling softly in the moonlight. Artemis rose slowly, letting the bough rest across her shoulder, motioning for Orion and the nymphs to rise. They moved along the edges of the clearing, careful to step lightly over moss and roots, following the quiet pulse of the night. Fireflies began to appear, hovering above moss and water in golden arcs. Artemis raised her hand slightly, signaling stillness. The nymphs paused, watching, their faces reflecting the delicate glow. Orion crouched beside her, observing the gentle dance of light, the subtle movement of insects and small animals in the shadows. "This is the moonlit glimmer," Artemis whispered. "It shows the forest at its quietest, at its most alive. The moonlight touches everything, revealing the rhythm and harmony of life." They moved slowly, tracing the edges of the clearing, following subtle paths between ferns, moss, and small pools. A family of deer passed silently in the shadows, their steps light, ears alert. Artemis and Orion lowered their bows, moving as one with the rhythm of the forest. The hounds remained calm, tails low, muscles relaxed yet attentive. The nymphs observed the subtle interplay of light and shadow, the ripple of water, the movement of leaves, the gentle steps of creatures hidden among ferns and stones. Artemis led them to a small hill at the far edge of the clearing. From there, the moonlight spilled across the entire forest, silvering the tops of trees, glimmering on streams, and touching every stone, leaf, and flower. Orion stood beside her, letting the cool breeze brush his face. "It feels endless," he said softly, "like the forest stretches forever, and yet I feel part of it." Artemis nodded, bow across her shoulder, eyes reflecting the moonlight. "That is the forest," she murmured. "It is alive, eternal, and always moving. We walk within it, part of its song." The moonlit glimmer shows us the harmony of all things, the forest, the creatures, the water, the wind, and ourselves. A quiet rustle drew their attention. A doe and fawn emerged once more, moving slowly across the clearing, noses to the ground. Artemis stepped lightly toward them, the hounds remaining calm at her sides. She extended a hand gently, fingers brushing the soft moss. The fawn paused, looking toward her, eyes wide, then stepped closer to drink from a small pool. The mother watched quietly, trusting the presence of Artemis and her companions. The nymphs knelt, tracing patterns in moss and stones, observing the gentle ripple of water as the fawn drank. Orion crouched, following every subtle movement, the sway of leaves, the rustle of branches, the soft flow of water over stones. Every detail mattered. Every moment carried meaning in the moonlit glimmer. Artemis drew a single arrow, notching it lightly, releasing it toward a faint mark on a nearby tree. The arrow struck cleanly, the vibration echoing softly in the clearing. Orion followed, letting his arrow hum through the air, striking a mark without disturbing any creature. The fox reappeared briefly at the edge of the clearing, pausing to watch, then disappearing silently into the shadows. The deer lifted their heads, ears flicking, then resumed their careful movement. Artemis exhaled slowly, letting the stillness of the forest fill her senses. She led Orion and the nymphs back along the edge of the clearing, moving slowly, deliberately, in rhythm with the moonlit glimmer. The hounds padded quietly, noses brushing moss, tails low. Every step was part of the harmony, every breath synchronized with the pulse of life around them. At the far edge of the glade, A stream reflected the silver light of the moon. Artemis knelt beside it, letting her fingers touch the cool water. Ripples spread across the surface, catching the reflection of stars above. Orion mirrored her, tracing patterns in the water, observing the subtle movements of small fish beneath. The nymphs knelt nearby, hands brushing moss and stones, absorbing the quiet lessons of patience, observation, and harmony. Artemis whispered softly, "The moonlit glimmer is a gift. It teaches us to move carefully, to watch, to respect, and to become part of the rhythm of life. Every creature, every leaf, every breath is connected." The hounds lay quietly, breathing slow, ears flicking at the faintest sound. Orion exhaled, feeling the calm of the glade settle into his chest. The nymphs traced subtle movements of insects, water, and moss, letting the quiet song of the moonlit glimmer wash over them. Artemis rose slowly, bow resting lightly across her shoulder. She led her companions toward a path that curved through the forest, each step deliberate, careful, harmonious. The moonlit glimmer continued to touch moss, leaves, and stones, illuminating the forest with silver light. The hounds followed silently, tails low, ears alert. Orion walked beside her, stepping lightly, mindful of every movement. The nymphs mirrored their pace, breathing in rhythm with the forest, attuned to every subtle sound, every shift of shadow, every ripple of water. The forest exhaled softly, carrying the song of life, the quiet harmony, and the gentle glow of the moonlit glimmer into the night. Artemis paused on a hill, looking back at the clearing one last time. The moonlight touched every tree, every stream, every stone, every leaf. The deer moved silently into the shadows, the fox disappeared among the ferns, and the hounds rested at her sides. Orion exhaled slowly, eyes reflecting the silver glow of the forest, feeling the quiet strength and calm of the moonlit glimmer within him. The nymphs knelt one final time, hands brushing moss and water, absorbing the quiet rhythm of life. Artemis whispered softly, "Carry this rhythm with you always. Let it guide your steps, your breath, and your heart." Together, Artemis, Orion, the nymphs, and the hounds walked along the moonlit path, leaving the hidden glade, the deer, and the fox behind. The forest stretched wide around them, silvered in moonlight, alive with quiet songs of life. Every step was calm, deliberate, and harmonious, every breath connected to the pulse of the forest. The moonlit glimmer lingered in their hearts, a gentle reminder of patience, respect, and the quiet beauty of life. Artemis glanced at Orion and the nymphs, a faint smile on her lips. The forest, the streams, the creatures, and the silvered moon continued their song, carrying them gently forward into the night. And with that, Artemis led them onward, the moonlit glimmer reflected in their eyes, hearts, and steps, completing the rhythm of their journey through the forest, the hunt, and the quiet wonder of life.